It began with cold, so deep it felt alive. The kind of cold that didn't just sting the skin, it crawled beneath it. A cold that turned breath into smoke, footsteps into whispers, and the entire Ardennes forest into a frozen world suspended between silence and fear. Snow fell in slow, drifting spirals, settling on branches that sagged under its weight. Every tree, every road, every rooftop looked like it belonged in a world untouched by war. But Bastogne was already surrounded by danger. In the final days of December, the small Belgian town had become the eye of a storm no one expected. American soldiers marched through waist-deep snow, their boots cracking open sheets of ice. They carried rifles that froze solid. They wrapped torn blankets around their shoulders because their coats were too thin. They lit small fires in helmets to melt snow for drinking water. And through it all, they listened for engines, for footsteps, for the distant thunder that meant the enemy was moving. Bastogne had not asked to become the centre of the Battle of the Bulge. It simply found itself in the way. German armoured divisions encircled the town with brutal efficiency. Roads in every direction were cut off. Supplies dwindled fast. Ammunition ran low. Food ran out. The sky stayed grey, hiding the Allied aircraft that could have brought hope. And snow fell so heavily it swallowed tracks, erased footprints, and turned the entire landscape into a white labyrinth where nothing was certain except danger. Inside the town, the men of the airborne divisions dug foxholes into frozen earth. They huddled together in ruined buildings, listening to the wind whistle through shattered windows. Shells screamed overhead day and night. Mortar fire echoed against stone walls that had stood for centuries. The ground shook, the cold gnawed. The days blurred into each other like breaths on a frozen pane of glass. Yet they held. They held crossroads that were the lifeline of the front. They held ridge lines where visibility stretched no further than an arm's length. They held trenches where snow drifted so high it buried helmets. They held because if Bastogne fell, the enemy would break open the Allied front like glass. Messages were sent. Reinforcements were miles away, slowed by snow and ambush and terrain. There was no easy road, no clear path, no quick salvation, only endurance. Then came the demand for surrender delivered under a white flag. The answer was a single word, sharp as frost, spoken not as bravado but as certainty, a word that would echo across the winter for generations, a word that told the enemy exactly what these men intended to do. They would not leave, they would not break, they would hold Bastogne, no matter the cold, the hunger, the darkness. Days passed, nights grew longer, snow continued to fall. And then, through the winter fog, distant engines rumbled. American armour pushed through the forest, crawling forward against impossible odds. A relief column carved its way toward the town, and when it finally reached Bastogne, the siege was broken, not because the defenders were strong, but because they were unbreakable. Tonight, we return to that frozen circle of hell, to the foxholes half filled with ice, to the cracked lips and trembling hands, to the nights when hope flickered like a dying flame, yet refused to go out, to the men who endured the coldest battle of their lives and refused to surrender their ground, their courage, or each other. Before we begin, tell me in words where in the world you are listening from tonight and what the winter feels like there. Is it warm where you rest, or can you almost feel that Bastogne frost settling against your skin? And here is a second invitation, completely unique. Tell me what moment in history first captured your imagination, a battle, a story, a figure, anything, so I can understand what keeps you returning to nights like this. And a third, one-of-a-kind request. Share a name, a relative, a friend, a stranger from your family tree, someone whose memory deserves to walk with us tonight as we step into the cold of Bastogne. And if these long, quiet journeys into the past help you relax, unwind, or drift into sleep, consider subscribing. December 10th, 1944, a 19-year-old replacement soldier named Frank stepped off a transport truck in a snow-dusted Luxembourg village, his rifle still wrapped in factory grease. Around him, veterans from the 28th Infantry Division lounged against stone walls, smoking cigarettes and playing cards in the weak winter sunlight. One sergeant looked up, grinned, and delivered the words every replacement longed to hear. "Welcome to the vacation spot, kid. Nothing ever happens here." Frank would be dead in 6 days, killed in the opening hour of the largest battle the American army would ever fight. But on this quiet December afternoon, as church bells rang across the Ardennes forest and locals sold fresh bread to American soldiers, the war felt 1,000 miles away. The Ardennes sector stretched 80 miles along the German-Belgian border, a region of dense forests, steep valleys, and narrow roads that military planners on both sides considered nearly impassable for large-scale operations. It was terrain that swallowed armies rather than facilitated them. The American High Command had deliberately made this a rest area, a place where fresh divisions could acclimate to combat and exhausted units could recover before returning to the meat grinder battles farther north, south. Only 4 American divisions held this entire front, a deployment density so thin that individual companies were responsible for defending sectors that doctrine said required an entire battalion. In normal circumstances, military wisdom dictated 1 division per 5 miles of front. Here, each division covered 20 miles or more. The men stationed here knew they were stretched impossibly thin, but they also believed they were safe. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortifications, lay just beyond the forest. Conventional wisdom held that Germany was finished, bleeding out in a defensive crouch, hoarding its last reserves for a final stand on German soil. The Allied advance had swept across France in the summer and autumn, liberating Paris, crossing the Rhine's tributaries, pushing to Germany's doorstep. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, the vast bureaucratic apparatus commanding millions of troops across Western Europe, had concluded that Germany no longer possessed the fuel, equipment, or manpower for offensive operations. Every intelligence assessment pointed to German collapse, perhaps by Christmas, almost certainly by spring. The Ardennes, with its terrible roads and defensive terrain, seemed the last place Hitler would choose for anything ambitious. 100 miles behind the lines, in the French town of Mourmelon, the 101st Airborne Division was enjoying the closest thing to rest that elite paratroopers ever experienced. These were the men who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows, and then dropped into Holland for Operation Market Garden, the ambitious but ultimately failed attempt to seize bridges into Germany. They had been pulled off the line in late November, promised weeks of recovery, hot food, clean uniforms, and the kind of sleep that didn't involve artillery fire. A baseball tournament was underway. Passes to Paris were being issued. Equipment was being refurbished and replaced. The division's commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington for meetings. Acting command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander, a 46-year-old West Point graduate known for his sardonic humour and unshakable calm. McAuliffe had no idea he was about to become one of the most famous generals in American history. But even as soldiers played baseball and wrote letters home, a few men worried. Colonel Benjamin Dixon, the intelligence officer for 1st Army, had been filing increasingly urgent reports throughout early December. His staff had documented unusual German activity, radio traffic surging in sectors that had been quiet, night movements of troops and vehicles, captured prisoners who seemed better fed and equipped than recent norms would suggest. Dixon's December 10th report included a prescient warning. German forces were massing for a spoiling offensive aimed at disrupting Allied supply lines and buying time for Germany's faltering war machine. The report landed on desks at Supreme Headquarters, was read by staff officers who had read 100 similar warnings, and was filed away. After all, intelligence officers always worried. That was their job. The generals making operational decisions had bigger concerns: the push toward the Rhine, the competition between Montgomery and Patton over resources and glory, the logistical nightmare of supplying armies faster than ports could unload ships. In the Ardennes itself, some officers shared Dixon's unease. Major General Troy Middleton commanded 8th Corps, the formation responsible for this quiet sector. Middleton was a veteran of World War I, a thoughtful commander who understood terrain and logistics. He looked at his maps and saw the obvious problem. If the Germans attacked here with any real force, his thinly spread divisions would shatter like glass. He raised his concerns up the chain of command. He was told, politely but firmly, that the Ardennes was safe. The Germans lacked the strength for offensives. The forest was impassable. Intelligence said otherwise. Middleton returned to his headquarters and did what any good commander would do. He prepared for the worst while hoping for the best, positioning what reserves he had and ensuring his artillery knew the terrain. Deep in German-held territory, another set of preparations was reaching culmination. Adolf Hitler had personally conceived and planned an operation so ambitious, so reckless, that many of his own generals considered it madness. Codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, the operation called for 3 entire German armies to smash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive all the way to the Belgian port of Antwerp. If successful, the offensive would split the Allied armies in 2, trap British and Canadian forces north of the breakthrough, and potentially knock the Western Allies out of the war long enough for Germany to transfer forces east to deal with the advancing Soviets. Hitler assembled 200,000 men, 1,400 artillery pieces, and nearly 1,000 tanks for the attack. It was Germany's last operational reserve, scraped together from training units, rebuilt divisions, and the dregs of a collapsing war economy. If this failed, Germany had nothing left. The plan required absolute secrecy and perfect weather. Secrecy to achieve surprise, weather to neutralize Allied air power. Throughout November and early December, German units moved only at night, maintained radio silence, and assembled in the dense forests east of the border, where Allied reconnaissance could not penetrate. Soldiers were forbidden to speak about their mission. Maps were not distributed until hours before the attack. Even division commanders did not learn the full plan until mid-December. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, scraped together its last operational fighters and bombers for close air support, knowing they would be outnumbered but hoping low clouds would level the odds. German weather forecasters promised fog and overcast conditions through late December. Everything depended on the Americans not knowing what was coming until it was too late to react. The target area was chosen with brutal logic. The Ardennes was weak, defended by inexperienced or exhausted divisions. The terrain, while difficult, actually aided the attacker because it channeled American reinforcements along predictable routes that could be blocked. And, crucially, the region contained a small Belgian market town that sat at the convergence of 7 paved roads. In the roadless forests and muddy tracks of the Ardennes, those 7 roads were everything. Control them, and you controlled mobility for 100 miles in every direction. The town was called Bastogne. Population 4,000. Most Americans had never heard of it. In 2 weeks, it would be the most famous place on Earth. On December 15th, the night before the attack, American soldiers along the Ardennes front settled into their routine. Some wrote letters by candlelight in requisitioned farmhouses. Others stood watch in cold foxholes, counting the hours until rotation. Hot food came forward from field kitchens. Cigarettes were distributed. The company commander of F Company, 501st Parachute Infantry, wrote in his diary, "Another quiet day heard distant thunder, probably ours, hitting their positions." It was not thunder. It was the sound of 1,400 German artillery pieces being moved into firing positions, wheels muffled with rags, horses' hooves wrapped in burlap. At exactly 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, those guns would fire simultaneously and the quiet sector would cease to exist. The Battle of the Bulge was hours away, and the men sleeping in frozen foxholes had no idea that by nightfall their world would be unrecognizable. 5:29 in the morning, December 16th, 1944. In a foxhole near the German border, Private Joseph Schroeder of the 106th Infantry Division was thinking about breakfast. He had 45 seconds left in a world that made sense. At precisely 5:30, the horizon erupted. 1,400 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, creating a sound that soldiers would later struggle to describe. Not thunder, not explosions, but something deeper and more terrible, the sound of the earth itself breaking open. Schroeder remembered trying to scream but hearing nothing over the roar. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt louder than the noise. The German artillery preparation was scientifically calculated for maximum shock effect. Forward American positions absorbed the heaviest concentration, designed to kill observers and destroy communications before infantry even saw the enemy. Battalion command posts, known locations from German intelligence, received dedicated targeting. Road intersections where reinforcements would have to pass got special attention. The shells were mixed, high explosive to kill, smoke to blind, and illumination rounds bouncing off the low cloud ceiling to create artificial moonlight for the assault troops. American soldiers emerged from bunkers and foxholes into a world transformed into hell. Trees had become splinters. Foxholes had collapsed. Telephone lines, the primary communication method, lay cut in thousands of places. The few radios that survived were immediately jammed by hundreds of panicked reports, all trying to transmit simultaneously. Behind the artillery barrage came something worse: infantry. German formations had been training for this moment for months, rehearsing attacks on mock-ups of American positions. They knew where every machine gun nest should be, where anti-tank guns were likely sited, which buildings made good strong points. The 28th Infantry Division, holding the center of the American line, suddenly found itself fighting for its life in a dozen separate battles. Towns with names like Marnac, Hosingen, and Clairvaux became isolated fortresses as German assault teams bypassed strong resistance and pushed west. The pattern repeated along the entire front: overwhelming artillery, infantry infiltration, tanks exploiting breakthroughs. Within 3 hours, the American front line had ceased to exist as a coherent defensive position. It had fragmented into islands of resistance surrounded by advancing Germans. The fog aided German infiltration in ways that still seem almost supernatural. Visibility dropped to less than 100 feet in most sectors. American positions would suddenly discover, Germans among them, coming out of the white void, already inside the perimeter. One company commander described firing his pistol at Germans he could hear but not see, calling artillery on his own position because he had no idea where the front line was anymore. The Germans used the fog aggressively, employing special teams dressed in captured American uniforms to spread chaos behind the lines. These teams, part of Operation Greif, switched road signs, cut communications, and spread false reports of breakthroughs and retreats. The psychological effect multiplied the physical damage. Units couldn't trust their orders, couldn't confirm if adjacent units still existed, couldn't tell if the men approaching in the fog were friends or enemies. The scope of the attack became clear only slowly, as fragmentary reports reached higher headquarters. First Army initially dismissed the reports as local German probing attacks, nothing more serious than raids. But by noon, staff officers at headquarters were staring at maps covered in red markers showing German units reported in positions that should have been impossible. The 28th Infantry Division reported elements of 3 German divisions attacking its sector alone. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned north of the 28th, radioed that 2 of its regiments were surrounded and cut off. The 9th Armoured Division reported German tanks in locations 10 miles behind where the front line had been that morning. Someone at headquarters finally said what everyone was thinking: this was not a raid, this was an offensive. The German plan unfolded with terrifying precision in those first hours. 3 armies attacked simultaneously across the Ardennes front. 6th SS Panzer Army struck in the north, aimed at Liège and the flat tank country beyond. 5th Panzer Army, the strongest formation, attacked in the centre, targeting the Meuse River crossings. 7th Army covered the southern flank, its mission to block American reinforcements from Patton's 3rd Army farther south. The weight of the assault, the coordination, the surprise, all confirmed this was Germany's major effort. Hitler had gambled everything on achieving what he called a second Dunkirk, trapping and destroying Allied armies before they could retreat. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels prepared announcements of a great victory. In London and Paris, Allied political leaders would soon face the first serious crisis of confidence since D-Day. But the German plan had a critical flaw that would not become apparent for several. It required speed. The entire operation was predicated on German armoured spearheads reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours, crossing before the Allies could react, and then driving hard for Antwerp before American reserves arrived. Fuel supplies were calculated down to the last litre. Tanks carried only enough fuel to reach the Meuse, with the plan being to capture American fuel dumps along the way. This meant that any significant delay, any unexpected resistance, would cause the entire offensive to stall. The Germans had built a plan with no margin for error, and they were about to discover that wars rarely go according to plan. American resistance, though shattered and confused, did not collapse. Individual units fought on even after being surrounded. Officers improvised defences at road junctions and river crossings. The fog that aided German infiltration also slowed German mechanised columns, which found themselves navigating by compass through forests where one wrong turn meant hopelessly lost tank columns. By nightfall on December 16th, the situation had descended into chaos on both sides. German commanders reported great success. The American front line had been penetrated in multiple places. Thousands of prisoners were being marched east. Panzer divisions were moving west, faster than planned. But darker reports also filtered back. American resistance had been fiercer than expected. The roads were worse than anticipated, already clogged with German supply vehicles that could not pass the combat formations they were supposed to support. And the surprise, so complete in the first hours, was already wearing off. American artillery, once it understood what was happening, had begun firing massive concentrations on known German assembly areas. American reinforcements were reportedly moving toward the battle zone, though German intelligence could not yet determine which units or in what strength. The American High Command spent December 16th trying to understand what had just happened. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, Dwight Eisenhower received the first reports with disbelief, then alarm, then a calm that surprised his staff. Eisenhower immediately grasped two things. This was a major German offensive, and it represented an opportunity as much as a crisis. If the Germans were committing their reserves to an offensive, they were exposing themselves to counterattack and destruction. The key was not to panic, not to retreat, but to hold key positions long enough for overwhelming American strength to arrive and counterattack. Eisenhower began issuing orders. Every available division would move toward the Ardennes, north and south pincers closing on the German salient. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting in France, would move immediately to the northern shoulder of the breakthrough. And above all, certain key positions must be held at all costs, places where the road networks converged. Terrain features that controlled mobility. One name appeared on multiple staff officers' maps that evening: Bastogne, a small Belgian town that most generals had never heard of before. December 16th suddenly became the most critical position in the entire European theatre. 7 roads met in Bastogne, crossing terrain that was otherwise nearly impassable for mechanised forces. Control those roads, and you controlled movement across the entire southern Ardennes. Lose Bastogne, and German panzers would have a clear run to the Meuse River. As staff officers looked at their maps under dim electric lights, as reports continued to pour in of American units shattered or surrounded, as the magnitude of the disaster became clearer with each passing hour, one fact emerged with crystalline clarity. Whoever held Bastogne when this battle was decided would determine the outcome of the entire campaign. And at that moment, Bastogne was defended by nothing at all. December 17th, 1944, dawn. In a commandeered chateau outside Versailles, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower stood before a large-scale map of Belgium, his finger tracing roads that converged like spokes on a wheel. The hub of that wheel was Bastogne, a name his staff officers kept repeating with increasing urgency. Eisenhower, whose mild demeanour concealed one of the sharpest strategic minds in the American military, asked the only question that mattered: what do we have there right now? The answer came back within seconds. Nothing, sir. Rear area supply units, some engineers, wounded being evacuated through the town. No combat forces. Eisenhower's finger remained on the map. Then we'd better get something there fast, because if they take this crossroads, we lose the whole southern flank. Bastogne itself was unremarkable, a market town of 4,000 souls that had existed since medieval times as a trading centre where farmers from surrounding villages sold livestock and produce. Its strategic importance came not from fortifications or industry, but from simple geography. 7 paved roads radiated outward from the town square, penetrating in every direction through the Ardennes forest. In a region where forest tracks turned to impassable mud under rain or snow, where valleys and ridges channeled movement along predictable routes, those 7 paved roads represented the only reliable way to move supplies, reinforcements, and most critically, armour. The Germans understood this as clearly as the Americans. Every German operational plan for the offensive showed arrows converging on or passing through Bastogne. It was not a town they wanted to fight for, but a logistics hub they could not afford to bypass. The German commanders planning the offensive had engaged in intense debates about Bastogne throughout November. General de Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, argued that Bastogne should be taken quickly, in the first 48 hours, before the Americans could organize a defense. His staff planners showed that leaving Bastogne in American hands would force German supply columns to detour through forest tracks, adding hours to travel times and consuming precious fuel. But the timeline was impossibly tight. The panzers needed to reach the Meuse River by December 18th, just 2 days after the attack began. Stopping to reduce a defended town would consume time the Germans did not have. The compromise solution was typically German in its complexity. Bypass Bastogne initially, leaving infantry divisions to capture it, then use the roads once the town fell. The plan assumed American forces would be too scattered and demoralized to organize serious resistance. By the afternoon of December 17th, as American command centers struggled to track the rapidly evolving situation, one thing had become terrifyingly clear. German mechanized columns were racing west faster than American. Reinforcements could move east. The 202nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division, elite formations equipped with the latest German tanks, had broken through American lines and were driving hard toward Bastogne. If current speeds continued, German armor would reach the town by nightfall on December 18th. The nearest American combat unit capable of stopping them was the 101st Airborne Division, still resting at Mourmelon, 107 miles from Bastogne. Simple math said the Germans would arrive first. Unless something slowed them down, Bastogne would fall before anyone could defend it. The order to move reached the 101st at midday on December 17th. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, temporarily commanding in General Taylor's absence, received a telephone call from 8th Corps headquarters. Get your division to Bastogne. Yesterday, if possible. McAuliffe, whose dry humour would later become legendary, asked the obvious question, with what? Half my division is on pass in Paris, we don't have winter gear, and some units still have their weapons in maintenance. The answer came back with bureaucratic finality. Figure it out. You move in 6 hours. McAuliffe hung up the phone, turned to his staff, and delivered the order that would define his career. Gentlemen, we're going to war in our summer uniforms. Get every truck you can find and start loading. What followed was a masterpiece of organised chaos. The 101st Airborne Division, designed to fight as a light infantry force after parachuting behind enemy lines, had to transform itself into a mobile defensive force and do so with almost no preparation time. Soldiers on pass in Paris received telegrams recalling them immediately. Weapons were pulled from maintenance shops, some still disassembled. Ammunition was loaded directly from depot warehouses, bypassing normal supply procedures. 380 trucks were requisitioned, borrowed, or simply taken from other units. By 6 o'clock that evening, the first convoys were rolling north toward Belgium. Headlights on despite blackout protocols, drivers pushing their vehicles as fast as the roads allowed. The paratroopers, riding in open trucks through freezing December rain, had no idea where they were going or what they would face when they arrived. While the 101st raced north, other American units were buying time through desperate rearguard actions. The 10th Armoured Division, a veteran formation that had been resting near Luxembourg, received fragmentary orders to delay the German advance toward Bastogne by any means possible. Combat Command B, one of the division's 3 combat teams, was detached and sent north under Colonel William Roberts, with instructions that were brutally simple: hold the roads east of Bastogne until the 101st arrives. Roberts had 54 tanks, fewer than 40 tank destroyers, and about 2,000 men. German intelligence estimated he faced parts of 3 divisions, totaling nearly 20,000 troops. The math was impossible, but Roberts was that rare breed of officer who saw impossible odds as a problem to be solved rather than a reason to surrender. Roberts organised his forces with ruthless efficiency. He split Combat Command B into 3 task forces, each named after its commander: Team Cherry, Team O'Hara, and Team de Sobry. Each team was a balanced force, mixing tanks, infantry, engineers, and tank destroyers. He positioned them at villages east and northeast of Bastogne, Longvilly, Warden, and Neuville. These were not strong points to hold at all costs, but speed bumps, positions to slow the German advance for hours rather than days. Roberts told his commanders, fight until you're about to be overrun, then fall back to the next position. Make them pay for every mile. It was a strategy that would work brilliantly, but at a terrible cost. In the next 72 hours, Combat Command B would lose half its tanks and a third of its men. But it would buy the 101st Airborne just enough time. The 1st German armour reached the outskirts of Bastogne on the evening of December 18th. Panzerlehr Division, commanded by the aggressive General Fritz Bayerlein, approached from the east expecting minimal resistance. Instead, Bayerlein's lead elements ran directly into Team Cherry at Longville. The Germans, accustomed to American units retreating at the first sight of panzers, found themselves in a close-range armour duel with American tank destroyers firing from prepared positions. The battle lasted less than an hour, but destroyed the German timetable. Bayerlein pulled back to assess the situation, call up more forces, and prepare a proper attack. That delay, just a few hours, was enough. By midnight on December 18th, the first elements of the 101st Airborne were rolling into Bastogne from the west, exhausted, freezing, but ready to fight. McAuliffe arrived at 10 o'clock that night, driving directly to the Belgian barracks that served as 8th Corps forward headquarters. He found controlled chaos, staff officers trying to track units that no longer existed, radios crackling with distress calls from surrounded American forces, and a growing recognition that the German offensive was even larger than initial reports suggested. The Corps commander, General Troy Middleton, briefed McAuliffe with characteristic bluntness. "The situation is terrible. We're falling back on all fronts. You need to hold Bastogne, because if you don't, we lose everything south of here." McAuliffe, exhausted from the drive, asked the logical question, "How long do I need to hold?" Middleton's answer would echo through the coming battle. "Until Patton's Third Army can counterattack from the south. 2 days, maybe 3. Both men knew that was optimistic. Neither imagined it would be 8. Midnight, December 18th, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara sat in his tank on a frozen road 3 miles east of Bastogne, watching headlights approach through the darkness. For a moment, his hand moved toward the turret traverse, ready to engage what might be German vehicles. Then he saw the shapes. American trucks, hundreds of them, packed with soldiers whose silhouettes showed the distinctive helmets of airborne troops. O'Hara keyed his radio. "The cavalry has arrived." Behind him, Team O'Hara, battered from 2 days of fighting withdrawals, erupted in cheers. The race for Bastogne had been won by hours, maybe less. Now, the real battle could begin. The convoy carrying the 101st Airborne stretched for miles through the Belgian night, a snake of vehicles grinding north at speeds that terrified the drivers and their passengers alike. Trucks designed to carry 20 men held 30. Equipment was piled haphazardly because there had been no time for proper loading. Some units still lacked basic supplies, grenades, mortar rounds, even winter clothing. Private Don Malarkey, a veteran of D-Day and Holland, remembered looking at his fellow paratroopers in the truck bed and thinking they looked more like refugees than an elite combat unit. Most wore standard field jackets over wool uniforms, completely inadequate for the Belgian winter. Their boots, designed for summer campaigning in France, provided almost no insulation. Within hours of arriving in Bastogne, frostbite would become as dangerous as German fire. The journey north had been its own kind of nightmare. The roads, clogged with refugees fleeing the German advance and American supply units retreating in disorder, forced the convoy to navigate around abandoned vehicles, through terrified crowds, past burning towns where German artillery had caught retreating columns. Some truck drivers, exhausted from days without sleep, dozed at the wheel and veered off roads. Others, faced with seemingly impassable traffic jams, simply drove through fields and forests, following the vehicle ahead by instinct. Radio communication was almost impossible because different units used different frequencies and the December weather created constant static. Officers riding in the lead vehicles had to stop periodically, wait for the convoy to catch up, and do physical head counts to ensure no one had gotten lost. It was a miracle the division arrived at all, let alone in time. As the 101st poured into Bastogne through the night, Combat Command B's teams were fighting for their lives in the surrounding villages. Team de Sobry at Neuville faced the worst situation, surrounded on 3 sides by elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. The team's 54 tanks were dueling with German Panthers at ranges where American 75mm guns were nearly useless. Major William de Sobry, commanding from a cellar command post while German shells impacted overhead, understood his mission with perfect clarity. He was not there to win, he was there to delay. Every hour he held Neuville was an hour the 101st had to organise the defence of Bastogne proper. German after-action reports would later reveal that 2nd Panzer Division spent 12 critical hours trying to reduce Neuville, hours that allowed the American defence to coalesce. The German commanders approaching Bastogne that night faced a decision that would haunt German military historians for decades: attack immediately or wait for reinforcements. Panzer Lehr's Bayerlein argued for immediate assault. His reconnaissance reported American troops entering Bastogne but estimated their strength at perhaps a battalion or two, disorganised and unprepared. A sharp attack, even with just his division, might overrun them before they established proper positions, but Bayerlein's superiors disagreed. The original plan called for bypassing Bastogne, letting infantry divisions reduce it while the panzers drove west. Adhering to that plan meant continuing west through the night, leaving Bastogne temporarily in American hands but keeping the offensive timetable on track. After hours of debate at various headquarters, a compromise emerged. Bayerlein would detour south of Bastogne, avoid engagement, and continue west. Other German units would encircle the town and capture it shortly. This decision, made in German command posts lit by candles and the glow of radios, represented one of the critical what-ifs of the entire battle. Bayerlein himself would argue for the rest of his life that he should have attacked immediately. His panzers, experienced and confident from days of successful advance, might well have overrun the arriving American paratroopers before they could organise. The 101st, exhausted from the all-night drive, still deploying from their trucks, would have been vulnerable to a coordinated armour and infantry assault. But German commanders, trained to follow operational plans and avoid improvisation, chose adherence to doctrine over tactical opportunity. Bayerlein's Panzer Division motored past Bastogne in the darkness of December 19th, headlights briefly visible from the town's eastern outskirts, and continued west. The window closed. The Americans had their foothold. Dawn on December 19th revealed the scope of what McAuliffe had to defend. The town of Bastogne itself sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by low ridges and scattered villages. Those villages, places like Marvy, Bizery, and Foy, would become the anchors of the defensive perimeter. McAuliffe's staff worked through the morning, establishing 8 major strongpoints in a roughly circular pattern around the town, each centred on a village or terrain feature. The perimeter stretched roughly 16 miles in circumference, a huge area for a division of light infantry to defend. Normal defensive doctrine suggested the 101st should cover perhaps 5 miles of front. Here they would cover more than 3 times that, with no reserves and no fallback positions. If the Germans broke through anywhere, they would be in Bastogne itself. Organisation happened with remarkable speed considering the chaos. Colonel Roberts of 10th Armoured integrated his remaining teams directly into the 101st's command structure, rather than maintaining a separate chain of command. Tank and tank destroyer platoons were parcelled out to infantry battalions, giving each strongpoint some anti-armour capability. Artillery was the key advantage. 11 battalions totalling 132 guns had made it into the perimeter, an unprecedented concentration of firepower for such a small area. These guns, positioned in the centre of the perimeter, could fire in any direction, supporting any threatened sector. Fire control was centralised through a single command post, allowing multiple battalions to concentrate on single targets within minutes. This artillery density would prove decisive in the battles to come. By mid-afternoon, December 19th, the first serious German probes began testing the perimeter. 26th Volksgrenadier Division, a newly formed infantry division given the mission of actually capturing Bastogne while the panzers bypassed it, attacked from the southeast toward the village of Marvy. The attack demonstrated both German determination and American preparation. Volksgrenadiers advanced in company strength, roughly 200 men, expecting to sweep through a disorganised American rear area. Instead, they ran into entrenched paratroopers supported by tank destroyers and concentrated artillery fire. The attack shattered within an hour, leaving dozens of German dead in the snow and the survivors streaming back toward their start line. Similar probes around the perimeter produced similar results. The Germans learned, to their considerable surprise, that Bastogne was not going to fall easily. As night fell on December 19th, McAuliffe's headquarters received two critical pieces of information that defined the developing siege. First, German units had completed a full encirclement. Every road out of Bastogne was now under German control. The 101st, along with Combat Command B's remnants, various artillery battalions, and engineers who had been caught in the town, were completely surrounded. Approximately 18,000 American soldiers were now isolated in enemy territory with no ground line of communications to friendly forces. The second piece of information was more encouraging. Radio contact with 8th Corps headquarters confirmed that General George Patton's 3rd Army, 50 miles to the south, was being redirected north to relieve Bastogne. Hold for 2 more days, the radio message promised, and relief would arrive. McAuliffe read the message, handed it to his operations officer, and delivered his assessment with characteristic brevity. We can hold for 2 days. After that, we'll need ammunition. Neither man mentioned the obvious. If ammunition ran out, 2 days would become irrelevant. December 20th, 1944, 4 in the morning. Captain James Parker of the 327th Glider Infantry stood waist-deep in frozen Belgian soil, attacking the ground with an entrenching tool that sent painful vibrations through his frost-numbed hands. Around him, his company dug similar holes, some using bayonets, others their bare helmets, all working with desperate speed because dawn would bring Germans and foxholes meant survival. Parker had been in combat since Normandy, had survived 4 months of fighting, and knew the mathematics of warfare with grim certainty. Proper defensive positions cut casualties by half, sometimes more. But the ground was frozen solid, each shovelful requiring multiple blows, and dawn was perhaps 90 minutes away. He worked faster. The establishment of Bastogne's defensive perimeter represented improvisational warfare at its finest. McAuliffe's staff had no pre-existing plans for defending the town because no one had imagined the situation that now existed. Instead, they fell back on basic infantry doctrine and the terrain itself. The low ridges surrounding Bastogne provided natural defensive positions if they could be fortified. Villages offered buildings that could be converted into strongpoints. Roads and trails gave interior lines of communication, allowing rapid movement of reserves. The plan that emerged was elegantly simple. Create 8 strongpoints in surrounding villages, connect them with mobile patrols and observation posts, and concentrate artillery in the centre where it could support any threatened sector. On paper, it looked solid. In reality, it required spreading 10,000 combat infantry across a perimeter that should have held 20,000. The Belgian civilians caught in Bastogne faced their own impossible choices. Most of the town's 4,000 residents had fled during the first days of the German offensive, joining the rivers of refugees, clogging every westward road. But perhaps 1,000 remained, either unable to leave or unwilling to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations. These civilians would play a crucial role in the coming siege, though their contributions rarely appeared in official histories. Belgian families opened their cellars to American wounded, providing shelter that saved lives. Local farmers brought preserved food from hidden stockpiles, supplementing American rations. Some civilians served as guides, helping American patrols navigate the maze of forest trails around the town. A few became casualties, killed by German artillery that made no distinction between military and civilian targets. Organisation of the strongpoints followed military logic, but required constant adjustment for available forces. The 501st Parachute Infantry took positions around Neffe and Bizery on the eastern perimeter, directly facing the direction of heaviest German pressure. The 502nd Parachute Infantry occupied the northern sector, including Foy and Neuville, though Neuville itself had been evacuated after Team Desibry's fighting withdrawal. The 506th Parachute Infantry held the western approaches, less threatened but equally thin on the ground. The 327th Glider Infantry deployed to the southern perimeter at Marvy, where 26th Volksgrenadier Division's attacks had already demonstrated German intentions. Each regiment covered 3 to 4 miles of front, with battalions that had perhaps 500 effectives after the fighting of previous days. The gaps between strong points were covered by observation posts, patrols, and prayers. The integration of armour into this light infantry defence created a hybrid force, unlike anything in American doctrine. Colonel Roberts' remaining tanks and tank destroyers, perhaps 40 operational vehicles, after the fighting retreat, were distributed individually or in small platoons to infantry companies. A typical strongpoint might have 2 Sherman tanks, 3 tank destroyers, and a platoon of engineers, in addition to its infantry company. This mixing of arms gave each position the ability to defeat German armour without requiring reinforcement from a mobile reserve. It also meant that if a position fell, the Americans lost their precious armoured vehicles along with the infantry. McAuliffe accepted this risk because he understood the alternative. Concentrating armour for mobile defence required open terrain and operational freedom that the surrounded perimeter did not provide. Artillery organisation represented the single greatest American advantage, though few recognised it at the time. The 11 artillery battalions trapped inside the perimeter included field artillery firing 105mm howitzers, medium artillery with 155mm guns, and even some corps-level heavy artillery that normally supported entire divisions. Colonel Thomas Sherburne, the senior artilleryman, established a centralised fire direction centre that controlled all tubes as a single weapon system. This meant that any American position under attack could call for fire support and receive concentrations from multiple battalions within minutes. German attacks would face not a single battery firing, but 18 or 36 guns simultaneously, their shells arriving within seconds of each other in what artillerists called time on target or TOT fires. The psychological effect was devastating, even when the physical damage was limited. Medical facilities were established in the Belgian army barracks on the southern edge of town, the largest building available and one with cellars that provided some protection against artillery. The division surgeon, Lieutenant Colonel David Gold, inherited responsibility for approximately 650 wounded, already in Bastogne from the earlier fighting, plus the casualties that would inevitably come. His supplies, hastily loaded during the movement from Mormelon, included enough bandages, plasma, and morphine for perhaps 5 days of normal combat. Normal combat, however, was already impossible. Gold's staff began rationing supplies on December 20th, before the siege had even fully begun. Serious wounds received full treatment, minor wounds got field dressings and returned to duty. The most serious cases, those requiring evacuation to rear area hospitals, were told to wait for relief that might never come. The ammunition situation was more immediately critical. Artillery had perhaps a 10-day supply at normal rates of fire, which meant perhaps 3 days if major German attacks developed. Small arms ammunition was adequate but unevenly distributed. Some companies had full loads, while others scrounged from destroyed vehicles and German dead. Tank destroyers had the most critical. Their 3-inch armour-piercing rounds were effective against German tanks but available in very limited quantities. Resupply officer Lieutenant William Somerville calculated that if every tank destroyer fired just 10 rounds, a light engagement by German armour standards, the entire stock would be exhausted. He recommended rationing. Fire only at confirmed targets. Let infantry engage with bazookas when possible. Husband the 3-inch rounds for Panthers and Tigers. His recommendations became division policy. As December 20th wore on, German pressure around the perimeter intensified. Small unit actions erupted in a dozen locations. A company-strength German probe against Bizery, a platoon-level engagement near Marvy, German reconnaissance patrols testing for gaps between American strongpoints. These were not yet the major attacks that would come later, but rather German commanders learning the extent and strength of American defences. Each probe revealed information, where American positions were strongest, where gaps existed, which routes offered covered approaches. German artillery, still deploying into firing positions, began registering on American-occupied villages, preparatory to larger operations. The defenders, exhausted from days without sleep, dug deeper and waited for what they knew was coming. By nightfall, McAuliffe's headquarters had a clearer picture of both friendly and enemy situations. The defensive perimeter was established, roughly organised, and holding against probes. 18,000 Americans occupied positions designed for twice that number, but the organisation made sense and morale remained surprisingly high. The Germans, from prisoner interrogations and radio intercepts, appeared to be shifting from bypass to siege. Multiple German divisions were now oriented on Bastogne, suggesting a deliberate decision to reduce the town before continuing west. This was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it meant the defence was already disrupting German plans. Terrifying because it meant sustained attacks were coming. McAuliffe spent that evening visiting battalion command posts, showing himself to soldiers who needed to see that senior leadership remained confident. His message was consistent. We hold until Patton arrives. 2 more days. The men believed him because they had no choice. December 1944, 05:30 hours. Major William de Sobry jerked awake to a sound he initially could not place, a deep mechanical rumbling that made the walls of his command post vibrate. He reached the doorway in time to see the muzzle flashes from dozens of German tanks firing into Neuville from 3 sides simultaneously. Team de Sobry, which had spent the night in this Belgian village 4 miles north of Bastogne, was about to fight for its life against one of Germany's elite panzer divisions. De Sobry's first thought, as shells began impacting around him, was brutally practical. How long can we hold before we're overrun? Team de Sobry represented one of Colonel Roberts's combined arms task forces, mixing tanks, infantry, and engineers into a balanced defensive unit. De Sobry commanded approximately 400 men, 15 Sherman tanks, and a handful of tank destroyers. His mission, delivered the previous evening by Roberts personally, was to hold Neuville as long as possible to delay German advance on Bastogne from the north. Roberts had been characteristically blunt. "I don't expect you to hold indefinitely. Fight until you're about to be destroyed, then withdraw. But every hour you hold is an hour the 101st gets to organise." De Sobry had nodded, saluted, and moved his team into Neuville, knowing this would be a delaying action with a predetermined bad outcome. The German force attacking Neuville was the 2nd Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced armoured formations. This division had fought in France, Russia, and now Belgium, and its commanders knew armoured warfare with brutal expertise. They approached Neuville not as a town to be captured, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. Their attack plan was methodologically German: artillery preparation, followed by tank assault, supported by infantry, followed by systematic reduction of any remaining resistance. What they did not expect was the intensity of American defensive fire or the courage of tankers who knew they were outgunned but fought anyway. The armour duel that developed in Neuville's streets represented everything terrible about close-quarters tank combat. American Shermans mounting 75mm guns faced German Panthers with high-velocity 75mm weapons that could penetrate Sherman armour at 2,000 yards. In the confined streets of a Belgian village, ranges dropped to 75 yards or less, distances where even the Sherman's weaker gun could penetrate Panther armour if it hit the right spot. Tank commanders fought from open hatches despite the danger, because closed hatches meant restricted vision and death from unseen threats. The noise was incredible. Tank cannons firing, machine guns chattering, buildings collapsing from shell impacts, wounded men screaming. Cordite smoke mixed with fog created visibility so poor that some engagements happened at ranges of 20 yards. Sergeant Robert Hunter, commanding a Sherman on Neuville's main street, described the battle with the detachment of trauma. "You saw shapes moving in the fog, fired at them, hoped you hit. Your loader was slamming rounds into the breach as fast as possible. The gunner was traversing, looking for targets. I was on the radio trying to coordinate with other tanks, but everyone was screaming at once. A Panther appeared maybe 50 yards away, gun traversing toward us. Our gunner fired first, hit the turret, the Panther stopped moving. Then another Panther fired from somewhere, hit the Sherman next to us. It just exploded. Burned so fast the crew didn't get out. Hunter's tank survived Neuville. The crew did not. They were killed 2 days later in a different engagement." De Sobry commanded from a cellar beneath a stone building, using field telephones to coordinate with his scattered positions. The command post itself was hit multiple times by German shells, wounding de Sobry with shell fragments that left his head wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. He refused evacuation, partly from duty, partly because evacuation was impossible. German forces had surrounded Neuville on 3 sides. The only exit was a narrow corridor south toward Bastogne, and that corridor was under constant German fire. De Sobry's radio operator maintained intermittent contact with McAuliffe's headquarters, providing situation reports that grew increasingly desperate. Ammunition running low, tanks being knocked out, casualties mounting. McAuliffe's response remained consistent: hold as long as possible. The German 2nd Panzer division commander, Colonel Meinrad von Lauschet, grew increasingly frustrated as the morning progressed. His operational orders required reaching positions west of Bastogne by nightfall, yet here his entire division was stalled, engaged in close combat with what intelligence had reported as a minor American blocking force. Von Lauschet committed more forces, bringing up assault guns and additional infantry, trying to overwhelm the American position through sheer weight. But Neuville's stone buildings provided excellent defensive positions, and the Americans had good fields of fire covering the approaches. Each German attack pushed into the village, engaged in brutal close combat, then withdrew to reorganize. Casualties mounted on both sides. By afternoon, de Sobry's situation had become untenable. Of his original 15 tanks, only 4 remained operational. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The infantry platoons defending the village perimeter had been reduced to squad strength. German forces had infiltrated between Neuville and Bastogne, making withdrawal even more dangerous than holding. De Sobry radioed McAuliffe requesting permission to evacuate. The response came from Roberts himself. "Get out while you still can. You've done enough." The withdrawal that followed became its own nightmare. Team de Sobry's survivors loaded wounded onto the remaining tanks and half-tracks, formed a column, and ran a gauntlet of German fire down the narrow road to Foy. German machine guns raked the column. Artillery shells impacted on the road, vehicles burned, but most of the force made it through, arriving in Bastogne's perimeter late that afternoon, exhausted, depleted, but intact. German after-action reports revealed what Team de Sobry's sacrifice had achieved. The 2nd Panzer Division spent 12 hours reducing Neuville, hours that should have been used advancing west. By the time Neuville finally fell, the 101st Airborne had established its defensive perimeter around Bastogne proper, making any further German advance from the north impossible without first reducing multiple strongpoints. Von Lauschitz's division, originally tasked with reaching the Meuse River by December 20th, found itself still east of Bastogne, engaged in a siege that was never part of the operational plan. The delay cascaded through the entire German offensive, disrupting timetables and consuming fuel. One small team of American tankers and infantry had achieved strategic effects far beyond their numbers. De Sobry himself, wounded and exhausted, refused medical evacuation even after reaching Bastogne's perimeter. He reported to McAuliffe's headquarters, blood still soaking through his bandages, and delivered his after-action report in clinical detail. 13 tanks destroyed, 11 killed, 44 wounded, 30 missing. McAuliffe listened, thanked him, and told him to get his wounds treated. De Sobry's response captured the ethos that would define the coming "I'll get treated when we're not surrounded." He returned to duty the next day, commanding a provisional company formed from the remnants of multiple units. He would fight through the entire siege, earning the Distinguished Service Cross, one of America's highest decorations for valor. But when asked years later about Neuville, de Sobry's only comment was, "We did what we were trained to do, hold until told to withdraw." Nothing heroic about it. December 20th, 1944, 1800 hours. Radio operator Private Eugene Tyler sat at his equipment in McAuliffe's command post, adjusting frequencies and trying to raise 8th Corps headquarters through increasing static. For 6 hours, he had maintained intermittent contact with the outside world, relaying situation reports and receiving updates on relief operations. Then, at precisely 6 o'clock, the channel went dead. Tyler adjusted his set, tried alternate frequencies, worked through every technical solution. He knew nothing. The last message from Corps had been, "Enemy closing from west. Anticipate complete encirclement by nightfall." Good luck. Tyler turned to his sergeant and delivered 2 words that transformed Bastogne's siege from temporary isolation to something more ominous. "We're alone." The closing of the encirclement had been inevitable from the moment German forces bypassed Bastogne on December 19th. While McAuliffe's forces established their defensive perimeter, German Panzer and Volksgrenadier units continued driving west and south, creating a noose that tightened throughout December 20th. By late afternoon, German forces had seized every road exit from Bastogne. The town and its 18,000 American defenders were completely surrounded, cut off from resupply, reinforcement, or evacuation. The nearest friendly forces were elements of Patton's Third Army, 50 miles south, and fighting their own battles. Between Bastogne and potential relief lay multiple German divisions, tens of thousands of enemy troops, and terrain that favoured the defence. McAuliffe received the news of complete encirclement with his characteristic sardonic calm. His operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, delivered the report, while staff officers clustered around the situation map, red markers showing German positions on every side. Someone mentioned the word surrounded, and McAuliffe's response would echo through military history. "They've got us surrounded." the poor bastards. The men in the command post laughed, partly from the joke's absurdity, partly from relief that their commander refused to panic. But beneath the humour lay cold calculation. Surrounded meant no ground resupply. Their ammunition, food, and medical supplies were finite. Unless relief arrived or air resupply proved possible, mathematics would determine the outcome more surely than courage. The German forces surrounding Bastogne represented a formidable array of combat power, though not as concentrated as American defenders feared. Parts of 7 German divisions had positions around the town. 2nd Panzer Division to the north, Panzerlehr to the east and south, 26th Volksgrenadier Division to the southeast, elements of 5th Fallschirmjäger Division moving into position from the south. Total German strength approached 45,000 troops, more than twice American numbers inside the perimeter. But these forces were not unified under single command or coordinated for a single mission. Some divisions were tasked with containing Bastogne, while others bypassed it. The result was German strength that looked overwhelming on maps but was actually fragmented and often working at cross purposes. The German command structure around Bastogne reflected the broader dysfunction plaguing the entire offensive. Operational control belonged to General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding 47th Panzer Corps. Von Luttwitz reported to General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, who reported to Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, who reported ultimately to Adolf Hitler himself. This chain of command, rigid and hierarchical, meant that tactical decisions around Bastogne required approval from headquarters dozens of miles away. Headquarters focused on the broader offensive rather than one besieged town. Von Luttwitz wanted to concentrate forces and reduce Bastogne quickly. Von Manteuffel wanted to bypass it and drive west. Model wanted both. Hitler wanted Antwerp. The result was operational paralysis, disguised as proper military procedure. Intelligence gathering became critical for both sides once the encirclement closed. American reconnaissance patrols ventured outside the perimeter nightly, gathering information on German positions and intentions. These were small unit actions, squad or platoon strength, slipping through gaps in German lines to observe, capture prisoners, or simply prove that the perimeter was not sealed completely. The intelligence they gathered painted a concerning picture. German forces were building up strength rather than moving west, suggesting a deliberate decision to reduce Bastogne before continuing the offensive. Prisoner interrogations confirmed this. German soldiers captured in patrol actions spoke of being told Bastogne would fall within days, that American forces were surrounded and demoralized, that the offensive would resume once this obstacle was eliminated. German intelligence about American forces in Bastogne was surprisingly accurate in some ways, dangerously wrong in others. They correctly identified the 101st Airborne Division as the primary American unit, correctly estimated American strength at approximately 15 to 18,000 troops, and correctly understood that American artillery represented a significant threat, but they completely misjudged American morale and determination. German intelligence summaries described American forces as surrounded remnants, likely to surrender if pressed. This fundamental miscalculation would shape German tactics in the coming days, encouraging attacks that were aggressive but not overwhelming, confident but not cautious. The Germans were about to learn that the 101st Airborne, the division that jumped into Normandy and fought in Holland, did not surrender easily. Life inside the encircled perimeter took on strange rhythms. Soldiers occupied positions they had hurriedly prepared, improving them continuously despite frozen ground and limited tools. Meals were K-rations, supplemented by Belgian civilians who shared what little they had. Water came from wells and pumps, carefully tested for contamination because German artillery deliberately targeted water sources. Sleep was stolen in brief increments, never more than an hour or two before being awakened for guard duty or German attacks. The wounded accumulated in aid stations, receiving treatment when supplies allowed, waiting when they did not. Morale remained surprisingly high, partly from confidence in leadership, partly from the paratroopers' elite self-image, partly from the darkly humorous recognition that being surrounded meant they could shoot in any direction without worrying about friendly forces. Communication with the outside world became entirely dependent on radio. Tyler and his fellow radio operators maintained contact through increasingly difficult conditions. December weather created constant static. German jamming efforts disrupted frequencies. The radio equipment itself, designed for tactical communication over short distances, was being pushed to its limits, trying to reach headquarters 50 or more miles away. but the radios worked enough to maintain awareness of the broader situation. Bastogne's defenders learned that Eisenhower had declared the town must be held at all costs, that Patton was redirecting his entire Third Army northward for relief, that the 82nd Airborne Division was fighting on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. They were not forgotten. They were not abandoned. They just had to hold. The psychological impact of encirclement varied by individual and unit. Some soldiers found it terrifying, the knowledge that retreat was impossible and survival depended on holding fixed positions against superior forces. Others found it liberating, the certainty that there was no option except to fight, eliminating any ambiguity about duty. Captain Richard Winters, commanding a company in the 506th Parachute Infantry, remembered thinking that encirclement simplified everything. No more confusion about objectives or missions. We defended this perimeter. If Germans came, we killed them. If they didn't come, we prepared for when they would. It was almost peaceful in its clarity. Not everyone shared Winter's Zen-like acceptance, but the sentiment captured something real about the siege mentality that was developing. By midnight, December 20th, the situation was clear to everyone inside Bastogne's perimeter. They were surrounded by German forces that outnumbered them significantly. Ground resupply was impossible. Ammunition would not last more than a few days of heavy combat. Medical supplies were already critically short. Relief was promised, but days away at minimum. The weather remained overcast, preventing air support or resupply. And German attacks were intensifying, probing every sector of the perimeter, testing for weaknesses. The mathematics were stark. Hold long enough for relief to arrive, or run out of ammunition and face surrender or annihilation. McAuliffe assembled his battalion commanders that night and delivered a message as simple as it was unyielding. Gentlemen, we hold this position. I don't care what the Germans do. We hold. Patton is coming. We just have to last until he gets here. No one asked how long that would be. They all knew the answer: as long as necessary. December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. Captain James Adams, commanding F Company of the 327th Glider Infantry, stood at his command post near Marvey, watching 4 German soldiers approach under a white flag. They moved carefully through the snow, 2 officers and 2 enlisted men, one carrying a large white banner that snapped in the cold wind. Adams's first instinct was to shoot them. White flags could be tricks, and his men had been fighting Germans for 3 days straight. But military custom demanded respect for parleys, so he sent a patrol forward to blindfold the Germans and bring them in. The senior German officer carried a document in a leather case. Adams opened it, read the typed German text, and felt his stomach tighten. It was an ultimatum demanding surrender. The German message was formal, almost courteous in its phrasing, but the threat beneath the politeness was unmistakable. It addressed itself to the USA, commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, and appealed to the well-known American humanity to avoid the annihilation of the USA troops and prevent civilian casualties. The document gave Bastogne's defenders 2 hours to respond, warning that refusal would result in total destruction by German artillery and air forces. It was signed by the commander of the German forces surrounding Bastogne, though the signature was illegible. Adams read it twice, trying to process the implications. The Germans were offering terms. That meant they feared the cost of taking Bastogne by assault, but it also meant they were confident enough to demand surrender, which suggested they believed the American position was hopeless. Adams sent the German officers, still blindfolded, back to his battalion headquarters while he radioed division. The blindfolds were both courtesy and security. Adams did not want the Germans seeing American defensive positions or the condition of American troops. His report to battalion was terse. Germans under white flag delivered surrender, demand, request instructions. The message worked up through channels with remarkable speed. In McAuliffe's command post, staff officers clustered around as the ultimatum was read aloud. The room fell silent. Someone muttered that the Germans must be desperate to try this. Someone else noted that the 2-hour deadline was absurdly short, barely time to consult with higher headquarters, even if radio contact was reliable. Then all eyes turned to McAuliffe, who had been awakened from desperately needed sleep to handle this development. McAuliffe read the German ultimatum once, looked up at his staff, and delivered a one-word response that would become the most famous utterance of the entire Battle of the Bulge. Ah, nuts. He handed the paper back to his operations officer and started to return to his cot for more sleep. The staff officers stood frozen, unsure if this was the pro's actual response or simply the general's initial reaction. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the operations officer, followed McAuliffe and asked what formal reply should be sent to the Germans. McAuliffe, already half asleep, mumbled that his initial reaction would be hard to beat. Kinnard returned to the other officers with a slight grin. He says, "Nuts," is our official response. The room erupted in nervous laughter, partly from the absurdity, partly from relief that their commander refused to even consider surrender. The challenge became translating McAuliffe's response into something the Germans would understand, while preserving its defiant brevity. Staff officers debated various formulations. Some argued for a formal military refusal, citing international law and the laws of land warfare. Others suggested a more colourful response that would leave no doubt about American intentions. Kinnard, acting as chief editor, settled on elegant simplicity. He typed on a single sheet of paper, "To the German commander, nuts the American commander," 4 words, counting the signature. The typing was slightly off-centre, giving the document an informal quality that somehow enhanced its impact. This was not a carefully considered diplomatic response, but rather the immediate reaction of soldiers who found the German demand both insulting and absurd. Delivering the response created its own memorable scene. The blindfolded German officers were brought back to Adams's command post, where they waited with visible anxiety for the American answer. Adams, who had been briefed on McAuliffe's response, handed them the type sheet. The senior German officer, a major, removed his blindfold and read the English text with obvious confusion. He turned to Adams. "What does this mean?" Adams, enjoying the moment despite the circumstances, replied, "It means the same as go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you continue this foolish attack, we're going to kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German officer stiffened, saluted with Prussian formality, and said, "We will kill many Americans. This is war." Adams's response was equally formal. "On your way, bud, and good luck to you." The Germans were blindfolded again, led through American lines, and released to return to their headquarters. The German reaction to McAuliffe's response revealed much about the cultural and psychological gulf between the two armies. General von Luttwitz, commanding the German forces around Bastogne, had authorized the surrender demand partly from genuine concern about casualties and partly from conviction that the American position was hopeless. He expected either acceptance or a counter-proposal opening negotiations. The one-word refusal, once finally translated and explained, left him genuinely baffled. German military culture emphasized formal procedures, proper protocols, and respect for rank and ceremony. McAuliffe's nuts violated all these norms. Von Luttwitz reportedly said to his staff, "These Americans are crazy." They refuse even to discuss terms. One of his subordinates suggested this meant the Americans were more dangerous than intelligence had estimated. Von Luttwitz agreed and ordered preparations for a major assault. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, news of McAuliffe's response spread with remarkable speed. Soldiers who had been grimly holding positions, worried about ammunition shortages and the growing German pressure, suddenly found themselves laughing. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details and embellishments. McAuliffe had been playing poker when the ultimatum arrived, or he had been eating breakfast, or he had told the Germans to perform anatomically impossible acts. The core truth that their general had responded to a surrender demand with a single dismissive word captured perfectly the division's self-image. They were the Screaming Eagles, the 101st Airborne, men who jumped out of airplanes behind enemy lines. Surrender was never part of their vocabulary. Nuts became a rallying cry, shouted between positions, used as a password, written on shells before they were fired at German positions. The psychological impact extended beyond simple morale. The exchange confirmed for the defenders that German confidence was not absolute. An enemy certain of victory does not offer surrender terms. They simply attack until the position falls. The very fact that the Germans had made the offer suggested they feared the cost of assault. This realization rippled through the American ranks. The Germans were worried too. They were also cold, also short on supplies, also fighting in terrible conditions. The siege was a test of endurance for both sides, and whoever broke first would lose. McAuliffe's defiant response was not just words, but a statement of intent. The 101st would not break. Let the Germans try. Let them come. The defenders would be waiting. But beneath The bravado and laughter, the situation remained desperately serious. McAuliffe's staff knew what the general himself understood perfectly. Defiance was emotionally satisfying but tactically meaningless without ammunition. Artillery stocks were sufficient for perhaps 2 more days of heavy fighting. Small arms ammunition was adequate but not abundant. Tank destroyer rounds remained critically short. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, with surgeons already performing operations without proper anesthesia. Food was short enough that soldiers were sharing K-rations and supplementing with whatever Belgian civilians could provide. And the weather remained overcast, preventing air resupply or support. Nuts was magnificent theatre, but mathematics remained merciless. Unless the weather cleared or Patton arrived, the siege would end badly, no matter how defiant the defenders. The German response to McAuliffe's refusal came swiftly and predictably. Increased artillery fire and preparations for major assault. Throughout December 22nd, German guns pounded American positions with growing intensity. Forward observers reported German troops massing in assembly areas, tanks moving into attack positions, engineers reconnoitering American obstacles. The pattern was obvious. The Germans were done with probes and ultimatums. They were preparing for a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the defences through sheer weight. Intelligence estimates suggested the attack would come on Christmas Eve, giving German forces 2 days to prepare. McAuliffe's headquarters sent updated situation reports to 8th Corps via radio, rejected German surrender demand, anticipate major attack within 48 hours, ammunition status critical, request immediate air resupply if weather permits. The response came back hours later. Weather forecast unchanged, resupply not possible. Patton attacking north, estimate 4 days to reach you. Hold at all costs. 4 more days. McAuliffe read the message, calculated ammunition expenditures, and wondered if they had 4 days' worth of shells. December 21st, 1944, 0800 hours. Lieutenant William Somerville stood in a frozen field that served as Bastogne's ammunition supply point, clipboard in hand, conducting an inventory that he already knew would produce devastating results. Around him, wooden crates and steel shell casings were organized in neat rows, each marked with caliber and type. He counted, recounted, and checked his mathematics 3 times because the numbers were so bad he assumed calculation errors. They were not errors. At current rates of expenditure, the artillery would run out of ammunition in 48 hours. The tank destroyers had perhaps 20 rounds per gun remaining. After that, American armour would be reduced to machine guns. Somerville walked to McAuliffe's headquarters to deliver news that could lose the battle. The supply situation had been precarious from the moment the 101st deployed to Bastogne. The division had moved with only the ammunition carried on its trucks, no reserve stocks, no follow-on supply convoys. Everything had happened too fast for proper logistics. Combat Command B had arrived with whatever its vehicles could carry after days of fighting withdrawal. The artillery battalions had full basic loads, but nothing beyond that. Now, after 3 days of siege, including the major engagement at Neuville and continuous defensive fires around the perimeter, those initial stocks were dangerously depleted. Somerville's inventory revealed the scope of the crisis. 105mm howitzer ammunition down to 200 rounds per gun, normally a single day's intensive fire. 155mm guns down to 100 rounds per tube. 3-inch tank destroyer rounds, critically important for defeating German armour, down to 18 rounds per vehicle. McAuliffe received Somerville's report with visible concern, one of the few times his staff saw the facade of confidence crack. He asked the obvious question, how long can we sustain defensive fires at current German pressure? Somerville's answer was brutally precise. 2 days, maybe 3, if we ration strictly. After that, we're reduced to small arms and prayers. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the mathematics. American defensive success depended absolutely on concentrated artillery fire. German attacks had been defeated not primarily by rifle fire, but by massed artillery concentrations that shattered assault formations before they reached American lines. Without artillery, German armour and infantry would close to point-blank range where American light infantry would be overwhelmed. The siege would become a matter of when, not if, the perimeter collapsed. The decision to ration artillery was made immediately, but implementing it required both mathematical precision and psychological finesse. Battalion commanders were told to reduce fire missions to absolute necessities only. Forward observers were instructed to call for fire only on confirmed targets that directly threatened American positions. The practice of firing harassment and interdiction missions, random shells intended to disrupt German preparations, was suspended entirely. Most controversially, fire support was rationed by sector. If one part of the perimeter came under attack, artillery support would be concentrated there while other sectors went without. This meant that American positions not currently under assault would have to hold with only their organic weapons, hoping the Germans did not attack them simultaneously with the supported sector. The policy was militarily sound but psychologically difficult for troops who knew that artillery was their primary advantage. Medical supplies presented an even more immediate crisis because wounded soldiers were visible, suffering evidence of shortages. By December 21st, the aid stations housed nearly 700 wounded, far exceeding the division's organic medical capacity. Surgeon Eugene Zellner worked in a converted Belgian barracks, its cellars filled with men lying on straw because there were no longer enough litters. Morphine, the primary pain medication, was so scarce that it was reserved only for the most severe wounds. Plasma for treating shock and blood loss had run out completely on December 20th. Bandages were being washed, sterilized, and reused. Antibiotics, the miraculous sulfur drugs that prevented infection, were rationed so strictly that only penetrating wounds received them. Lesser wounds got field dressings and were sent back to their units with instructions to change the dressing daily. Surgery in these conditions bordered on medieval. Zellner and his surgical teams performed amputations by flashlight because electric power was unreliable and generators needed fuel for more critical purposes. Anesthesia was often simply a shot of whiskey and a leather strap to bite. The most serious cases, those requiring extensive surgery or specialized treatment, were placed in a separate area with a designation that no one spoke aloud: expectant. These men would receive comfort care but no active treatment because the resources did not exist to save them. They would either recover on their own or they would die. Medical staff rotated through the expectant ward, providing water, adjusting bandages, sometimes just holding hands. It was triage in its most brutal form. Save those who can be saved, provide comfort to those who cannot, and make those decisions 100 times per day. Food shortages were less critical than ammunition or medical supplies, but still concerning. K rations, the individual daily meal pack issued to American soldiers, were available but monotonous and insufficient for men burning thousands of calories daily in cold weather combat. The Belgian civilian population, though itself facing shortages, shared what they could: preserved vegetables from cellars, bread baked in wood stoves, even livestock slaughtered and distributed. Some American units supplemented their rations by liberating supplies from German dead or captured positions. Wehrmacht rations, though no better than American, at least provided variety. One sergeant recorded finding canned meat and dark bread on a German corpse, distributing it to his squad, and being surprised to find it actually not bad. Fuel shortages threatened mobility and heating. Tanks and vehicles consumed gasoline at rates that peacetime logistics had never anticipated. Tank destroyers, designed for mobile defence, were being kept stationary to conserve fuel. Some Shermans were immobilised entirely, their fuel tanks drained to provide gas for more critical vehicles. Heating fuel for buildings was non-existent. Soldiers relied on body heat, shared blankets, and small fires built from wood scrounged from destroyed buildings. The cold was a constant enemy, as dangerous as German fire. Frostbite casualties accumulated daily, toes and fingers that turned black and would eventually require amputation, though those amputations would have to wait until the siege ended and proper medical facilities became available. The ammunition crisis forced changes in tactical doctrine. Infantry companies, accustomed to calling for artillery at the first sign of German activity, now held their fire and fought with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. This meant allowing German forces to close to ranges under 100 yards before engaging, psychologically terrifying for defenders who knew that German soldiers getting closer meant increased danger. Bazooka teams became more important as primary anti-armor defense. The 2.36-inch rocket, while less effective than 3-inch tank destroyer rounds, at least did not depend on the critical ammunition shortage. Soldiers trained on hasty bazooka techniques: wait until the tank is within 50 yards, aim for side or rear armour, where it was thinnest, fire and immediately relocate because the backblast revealed your position. Resupply by air represented the only solution, but weather made it impossible. December weather over Belgium had been overcast continuously since December 16th, with cloud ceilings often below 100 feet. No aircraft could navigate in those conditions, let alone find a besieged town and drop supplies accurately. Weather forecasters at 8th Corps and Higher Headquarters studied reports obsessively, looking for any break in the pattern. The forecast remained stubbornly consistent, overcast through December 25th at minimum, possibly longer. McAuliffe's headquarters radioed daily requests for air resupply, and daily received the same response. Weather prohibits flight operations. Continue holding. The phrase continue holding began to seem darkly absurd. What choice did they have? Scavenging became an essential supply technique. After each German attack, American patrols ventured into the areas where combat had occurred, searching dead Germans and destroyed vehicles for anything useful. German small arms ammunition was incompatible with American weapons, but other supplies were universal: blankets, food, medical supplies, even cigarettes. One sergeant organized his platoon into an efficient salvage operation, assigning specific men to search for specific items. They found morphine on a German medic, artillery fuses in a destroyed supply vehicle, and once, improbably, a crate of French wine that had somehow ended up in a German position. The wine was distributed to the aid station, where it served as anesthesia for 3 surgeries. By December 22nd, the supply crisis had become the defining challenge of the siege. Tactical skill, courage, and determination could not overcome mathematics. The defenders had finite resources facing an enemy with near infinite resupply. Unless the weather broke and air resupply became possible, or unless Patton's relief force arrived, the siege would end in surrender or annihilation, regardless of how bravely the defenders fought. McAuliffe understood this with perfect clarity. His evening briefing to battalion commanders on December 22nd included an admission he had previously avoided. "Gentlemen, we need a miracle. Either the weather has to clear, or Patton has to arrive faster than any army has ever moved. Absent those miracles, we're looking at approximately 4 days before our artillery goes silent. After that, I don't need to tell you what happens." No one responded because everyone knew. After that, they would fight with rifles until the rifles ran out of ammunition, and then they would fight with grenades and knives and fists, and then they would be overrun. The only question was whether the miracle would arrive in time. December 23rd, 1944, 0600 hours. General Hasso von Manteuffel stood in his command post 30 miles east of Bastogne, staring at a situation map that showed his 5th Panzer Army's advance as a great bulge driving west toward the Meuse River. The bulge was impressive. At its deepest point, German forces had penetrated 60 miles into Allied lines. But von Manteuffel's experienced eye saw the problem immediately. His armoured spearheads, particularly the 2nd Panzer Division, had reached the village of Dinant on the Meuse, but were now stalled, surrounded by American forces, and critically short of fuel. The supply lines that should have been feeding these spearheads ran through Bastogne. Except Bastogne remained in American hands, forcing German supply convoys to detour through forest tracks that turned vehicles into stuck, useless hulks. Von Manteuffel traced the routes on his map and spoke aloud what his staff already knew. "Bastogne is strangling us." The German command structure had been arguing about Bastogne since December 19th, and those arguments had intensified with each passing day. Von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, wanted Bastogne taken immediately and had been requesting permission to concentrate forces for a major assault. His superior, Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, agreed in principle but was distracted by crises across the entire offensive. The northern shoulder, where 6th SS Panzer Army was supposed to achieve the breakthrough, had stalled completely with horrific casualties. The southern shoulder faced increasing pressure from Patton's 3rd Army, and everywhere German forces were running out of fuel, a problem that Bastogne directly caused by forcing supply vehicles onto inadequate roads. Model's orders to von Manteuffel were contradictory. Take Bastogne quickly but don't slow the western advance. Concentrate forces for assault but maintain pressure everywhere. Minimize casualties but achieve decisive results. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding 47th Panzer Corps and directly responsible for Bastogne, faced the most immediate frustration. His corps included multiple divisions, but those divisions were scattered across 50 miles of front, some bypassing Bastogne to continue west, others tasked with containing the town, still others fighting American forces farther south. Von Lüttwitz could not concentrate force because higher headquarters kept assigning different missions. On December 23rd alone, he received 3 separate orders: reduce Bastogne with maximum speed, maintain mobile forces for western exploitation, and prepare reserves for commitment near Dinant, where 2nd Panzer Division was in crisis. Following all 3 orders was impossible, so von Lüttwitz did what German officers had learned to do in the face of contradictory commands. He chose one priority and ignored the others. His priority was Bastogne. If the Americans there could be destroyed, other problems might become solvable. The German forces assigned to assault Bastogne represented a strange mixture of elite and second-rate formations. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, newly arrived from Germany, was composed of paratroopers with training and morale comparable to American airborne. These were dedicated soldiers, well-equipped and confident. But other units were Volksgrenadier divisions, formations thrown together from replacement depots, recovered wounded, and teenagers conscripted in the war's final months. These units had numbers but lacked the training and cohesion of veteran formations. The armoured support was similarly mixed. Some Panthers and Tigers, formidable weapons that outclassed American tanks, but also older Mark IVs and captured French vehicles pressed into German service. Von Lüttwitz looked at this force and knew it could overwhelm Bastogne's defenders, but only if properly concentrated and coordinated. Achieving that concentration was proving maddeningly difficult. German reconnaissance of Bastogne's defences had identified what appeared to be weak points, though those assessments would prove catastrophically wrong. Aerial photographs, taken during brief breaks in cloud cover, showed the American defensive perimeter and the villages that anchored it. German intelligence officers marked what they believed were the least defended sectors, Marvy on the southeast and Champs on the northwest. These were logical choices based on terrain and observed American activity. What German intelligence failed to recognise was that every sector of the perimeter was defended by approximately the same thin force, and every sector could call on the massive American artillery concentration in Bastogne's centre. There were no weak points in the traditional sense, only sectors where the defenders were spread equally thin. The Germans were about to attack positions they thought were lightly held and discover they were walking into concentrated artillery. Fire. Coordination between German units proved nearly impossible despite careful planning. The Wehrmacht's command culture emphasized written orders, proper procedures, and adherence to operational plans. But the fluidity of the situation around Bastogne made such procedures inadequate. Units that were supposed to attack simultaneously attacked hours apart because of communication delays. Artillery preparation that should have supported infantry assaults fired at empty fields because forward observers could not see through the fog. Tank units detailed to support the Fallschirmjäger found themselves stuck on muddy roads, unable to reach their assigned positions. Von Lüttwitz's staff worked feverishly to coordinate the assault, issuing orders and counter-orders, trying to impose organisation on chaos. The result was a plan that looked elegant on paper and would prove disjointed in execution. The German psychological state varied dramatically between units. Elite formations like 5th Fallschirmjäger remained confident, their officers telling them the Americans were surrounded and demoralised, that one good push would shatter the defence. These soldiers believed what they were told, partly from inexperience, many had never fought Americans before, and partly from propaganda that assured them German superiority. But veteran units, those that had fought Americans in France or elsewhere, were more sceptical. They had learned to respect American artillery and American determination. One Panzer commander, briefing his crews before the Bastogne assault, warned, "The Americans in there are airborne. They don't quit. Expect a real fight." His crews listened but wondered if their commander was being overly cautious. They would discover he had been optimistic. German logistics around Bastogne mirrored the problems afflicting the entire offensive. Supply convoys, forced to detour around the American-held town, found themselves stuck on narrow forest tracks or bogged in mud. Fuel trucks that should have been feeding panzer divisions sat immobilized 20 miles from their destinations. Ammunition trucks were hijacked by local unit commanders who needed shells and did not care about proper supply procedures. Food supplies were inconsistent. Some German units ate well from captured American supplies, while others subsisted on whatever they could forage. The famous German efficiency, so evident in peacetime logistics, dissolved under the stress of rapid offensive operations in terrible terrain and weather. Von Manteuffel's staff calculated that taking Bastogne would solve perhaps 30% of their supply problems, enough to make the difference between success and failure. The Americans inside that perimeter had no idea they were threatening German logistics across a 100-mile front. German morale was sustained partly by ignorance of the broader situation. Soldiers fighting around Bastogne knew they faced determined American resistance, but they did not know that the entire offensive was failing. The northern shoulder had stalled, with German losses exceeding 10,000 men. The fuel crisis was so severe that some panzer divisions had immobilized their tanks to conserve gas. Allied air power, grounded by weather, was forecast to return and would devastate German columns once visibility allowed. German propaganda radio broadcasts claimed great victories and inevitable triumph, and soldiers believed because they had no alternative information. In reality, Germany was committing its last operational reserve to an offensive that was already defeated. Taking Bastogne might prolong the battle, but could not change the outcome. But German soldiers did not know this, so they prepared to attack with the conviction that victory was possible if they just fought hard enough. By the evening of December 23rd, German preparations for the major assault on Bastogne were approaching completion. Von Lüttwitz had managed to concentrate portions of 3 divisions, 5th Fallschirmjäger, 15th Panzergrenadier, and 26th Volksgrenadier for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Artillery support, scraped together from various batteries, would provide preparatory fire. Tank support, though less than planned, included at least 15 to 20 armoured vehicles. The attack was scheduled for early evening, December 24th, Christmas Eve, chosen partly for tactical reasons and partly for psychological impact. German officers believed Americans would be emotionally vulnerable on that holiday, perhaps distracted or demoralised. It was a miscalculation that revealed how little the Germans understood their enemy. The Americans defending Bastogne were beyond being demoralised by calendars. They were cold, hungry, low on ammunition, and surrounded. Christmas Eve was just another day to survive. December 24th, 1944, 1845 hours. Private Richard Ladd crouched in his foxhole near the village of Champs, northwest of Bastogne, watching the forest tree line 300 yards away and thinking about Christmas Eve services he would not attend. The snow around his position was tinged pink from the sunset, creating an almost peaceful scene that Ladd knew was deceptive. German artillery had been registering on Champs all afternoon, dropping ranging shots and adjusting fire. That meant an attack was coming. Ladd checked his rifle for perhaps the 20th time, made sure his grenades were within easy reach, and waited. At precisely 6:45, the forest tree line erupted with German artillery fire, and the deadliest night of the siege began. The German artillery preparation was the heaviest Bastogne's defenders had yet experienced. For 15 minutes, shells impacted across the entire northwestern sector, targeting Champs, the adjacent village of Hemrul, and the open ground between. The barrage was methodically German. First, high explosive. 2, kill and destroy. Then smoke to blind. Finally, illumination rounds that turned twilight into artificial daylight. The defenders, pressed into their foxholes, could do nothing but endure. Telephone lines to battalion headquarters were cut almost immediately. Radio operators struggled to report through the noise and confusion. Company commanders lost contact with their platoons. In those 15 minutes, the careful organisation of the defence dissolved into isolated positions, fighting by instinct and training. When the barrage lifted at 7 o'clock, German infantry emerged from the forest in waves that reminded American veterans of Soviet human wave tactics. 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, elite German paratroopers, advanced in company-strength formations across open ground, screaming to build their own morale and demoralise the defenders. Some shouted in English, "Surrender, and we have you surrounded." The effect was terrifying and surreal. Ladd remembered thinking, the Germans looked like ghosts in the snow and illumination, moving in irregular lines, falling as machine gun fire cut through them, then replaced by more coming behind. The volume of fire was incredible. German machine guns firing from the tree line, American machine guns answering from Champs, rifles firing so fast the barrels overheated, and above it all the screaming of wounded men in both languages. The American artillery response was delayed by the confusion of the initial barrage, but once it came, was devastating. Forward observers who had lost telephone contact switched to radio, calling fire missions with coordinates they had pre-registered during previous days. The call went to Colonel Thomas Sherburne's Centralized Fire Direction Center. Fire mission, enemy infantry in the open, coordinates as follows, maximum volume. Within 90 seconds, 18 artillery battalions, over 130 guns, fired time-on-target concentrations. The technique, perfected by American artillery in World War II, meant all shells arrived simultaneously, regardless of firing position. German soldiers advancing across open ground towards Champs suddenly found themselves in a firestorm. Artillery shells exploded among them in clusters, the shrapnel scything through flesh and equipment. The first wave, perhaps 200 men, was reduced to half strength in the first minute of fire. But the Germans kept coming. 5th Fallschirmjäger Division had been told Bastogne would fall if they pushed hard enough, and these were dedicated soldiers who believed their orders. Second and third waves advanced through the carnage of the first, taking casualties but closing the distance. Some groups reached within 100 yards of American positions before concentrated rifle and machine gun fire stopped them. A few German squads actually penetrated into Champs village, engaging in close-quarters combat in cellars and ruined buildings. Technical Sergeant Paul Kavanagh, commanding a platoon of glider infantry, fought a German squad room by room in a stone farmhouse, ultimately killing them with grenades because rifle fire was ineffective in the confined space. Kavanagh survived with a bayonet wound to his shoulder. All 5 Germans died. Tank support for the German attack was less effective than planned due to terrain and American defences. 15 German tanks, a mixture of Panthers and Mark IVs, were supposed to lead the assault but found themselves channeled into predictable routes by marsh and forest. American tank destroyers, positioned in hull-down positions with only their guns visible, engaged at ranges where the Germans could not effectively return fire. The 3-inch guns of the M10 tank destroyers, firing precious armour-piercing rounds, knocked out 3 German tanks in the first exchange. The surviving German armour pulled back to re-evaluate, leaving their infantry to assault without armoured support. This proved decisive. Infantry attacking entrenched positions without armour support suffers catastrophic casualties, and German losses reflected this mathematical reality. The battle reached its crisis point around 8:30 when German forces, despite horrific casualties, threatened to overrun the Champs position through sheer persistence. The American defenders were down to perhaps 60% effective strength, their ammunition running low, wounded accumulating in cellars with no time for evacuation. Company Commander Captain Robert MacDonald radioed battalion, "We're about to be overrun. Request immediate reinforcement or permission to withdraw." The response was unequivocal. "No reinforcements available. Hold your position. Artillery support is being concentrated on your sector." MacDonald relayed this to his platoon leaders. "We hold here. Artillery is on the way." What arrived was every available gun in the American perimeter, firing on pre-registered concentrations around Champs. Over 50 guns firing simultaneously, their shells creating a curtain of explosions between the American positions and the attacking Germans. The concentrated artillery fire broke the German assault. Survivors would describe the experience in terms of natural disaster, a tornado of steel, an earthquake of explosions, hell made manifest. German company commanders, trying to rally their men for one more push, found themselves commanding squads instead of companies. The advance stopped, wavered, then broke. German soldiers retreated toward the tree line in small groups, carrying wounded when possible, leaving the dead where they fell. American machine gunners fired into the retreating formations, partly from tactical necessity, partly from the adrenaline and rage of men who had just fought for their lives. By 9 o'clock, the attack had ended. The snow between Champs and the forest was carpeted with German dead and dying. Casualty counts took days to determine with accuracy, but initial estimates revealed the assault's cost. German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division reported losing over 650 men killed, wounded, or missing in approximately 5 hours of combat, nearly 30% of the attacking force. American casualties in the Champs sector totaled 121. Serious but sustainable. The exchange ratio, roughly 5 German casualties for every American, reflected the advantages of prepared defense and overwhelming artillery support. But the American ammunition expenditure was terrifying. Artillery battalions had fired nearly 20% of their remaining shells in those 5 hours. At this rate, the guns would be silent within 2 days. The assault had been defeated, but at a cost that could not be sustained much longer. Similar attacks occurred elsewhere around the perimeter that night, though none with the intensity of Champs. German forces probed at Marvi, Bizery, and other villages, testing for weaknesses and tying down American reserves. These were not fully coordinated attacks, because German command and control had broken down in the fog and darkness, but they kept American defenders on edge throughout the night, responding to attacks, reinforcing threatened positions, never knowing if the next attack would be a probe or a major assault. Captain Richard Winters, defending a sector near Foy, described Christmas Eve 1944 as the longest night of my life, and I've had some long nights. Every sound was Germans. Every shadow moved. We fired at anything we weren't sure of, wasting ammunition we couldn't afford to waste, but unable to take chances. Dawn on Christmas Day brought a strange quiet. The temperature had dropped overnight, creating a landscape of frozen beauty that seemed to mock the previous night's violence. Dead Germans lay in snow that had turned red, then frozen. American medics ventured into the contested ground to search for any wounded who might have survived, finding a few Germans still alive and bringing them in for treatment, despite the supply shortages. One medic asked why he bothered treating enemy wounded when American wounded lacked adequate supplies, responded, "Because that's what separates us from them. We're still human." But humanity had limits. Bodies that could not be buried because the ground was frozen were simply stacked like cordwood in abandoned buildings, awaiting the thaw. The Christmas Eve assault had failed, but it had achieved one German objective, proving that Bastogne would not fall easily. Von Lüttwitz reported to von Manteuffel that the Americans were fighting with unexpected determination, and that taking the town would require either significantly more force or a prolonged siege. Von Manteuffel, dealing with crises across his entire army, authorized continued attacks but could not provide additional forces. The German offensive was collapsing elsewhere. 2nd Panzer Division had been surrounded near Dinant, 6th SS Panzer Army had been thrown back with massive losses, and fuel shortages were immobilizing entire formations. Bastogne remained important, but it was no longer the critical objective. The Germans would continue attacking, but with decreasing conviction that success was possible. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, Christmas morning brought a gift more valuable than anything soldiers could have imagined: clear sky. For the first time since December 16th, the clouds lifted, revealing brilliant blue overhead. Men emerged from their positions, staring upward, hardly believing what they saw. Within minutes, someone spotted the first aircraft. A C-47 transport flying low from the west. Cargo door open, coloured parachutes blossoming behind it as supply bundles fell toward the perimeter. More aircraft followed, then more, until the sky seemed filled with planes and parachutes. Supply crews ran to recover the bundles, some of which had drifted into German-held areas, leading to brief firefights over ammunition and medical supplies. But most landed inside American lines, and within hours the critical shortages were being addressed. Artillery, ammunition, plasma, bandages, food, everything the defenders desperately needed was falling from the sky. The siege was not over, but the mathematics had changed. Bastogne could hold longer. December 23rd, 1944, 0900 hours. Captain John Jack Knobloch, a fighter pilot with the 4th Fighter Group, sat in the briefing room at his airbase in England, listening to the weather officer deliver the forecast. He had been waiting 8 days to hear clear skies over Belgium by dawn tomorrow, visibility unlimited. "This is your window, gentlemen." The room erupted in cheers. For more than a week, Allied air power had been grounded by the worst December weather in living memory. Now the weather was breaking, and every fighter bomber, transport, and reconnaissance aircraft in the theatre would launch to support the forces fighting in the Ardennes. Knobloch and his fellow P-47 Thunderbolt pilots would fly to Bastogne, and they would demonstrate why Germany had already lost this war. The air resupply operation to Bastogne was conceived and executed with remarkable speed. On December 22nd, when forecasts first suggested improving weather, 9th Air Force logistics officers began loading C-47 transport aircraft with supplies based on radioed requests from McAuliffe's headquarters. Each C-47 could carry approximately 3 tons of supplies in specially prepared bundles designed to be dropped by parachute. The bundles were colour-coded: red for ammunition, yellow for medical supplies, blue for food, white for general supplies. This allowed ground crews to prioritise recovery based on need. The loading continued through the night so that when weather cleared on December 23rd, 241 C-47 seconds were ready to fly. It was the largest air resupply operation yet attempted in the European theatre. The first transports arrived over Bastogne mid-morning on December 23rd, flying at low altitude to ensure accuracy. Pathfinder teams on the ground, paratroopers with coloured smoke grenades and signal panels marked drop zones in open fields inside the perimeter. The sight of American aircraft overhead after 8 days of isolation brought defenders out of their positions, cheering and waving despite the danger of German fire. Some soldiers wept openly. Others simply stood, staring upward, watching parachutes blossom like flowers. One sergeant described it as the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, better than any sunrise, better than any woman. Those planes meant we were going to live. Not every bundle landed safely. The wind, gusty even on clear days, carried some parachutes into German-held areas, leading to absurd battles over supply bundles. In one instance, American and German patrols raced toward a bundle that had landed in contested ground between the perimeters. The Americans won, recovering precious medical supplies, but lost one man killed in the brief firefight. McAuliffe's headquarters calculated that 96% of dropped supplies were recovered, an extraordinary success rate. The lost 4% hurt every shell and bandage mattered, but the supplies that did arrive transformed the situation. Artillery battalions that had been rationing rounds to 10 per day suddenly had full stocks. Medical teams received plasma and morphine. Soldiers ate hot food for the first time in days, cooked over fires, built with wood from supply crates. Fighter bomber support arrived simultaneously with the transports, and its effect was immediate and overwhelming. P-47 Thunderbolts, heavily armed with bombs and rockets, circled Bastogne looking for targets. Forward air controllers on the ground. Soldiers with radios and training to direct airstrikes. Called in German positions, tanks in woodlines, infantry concentrations, artillery, batteries. The P-47 seconds rolled in, diving from altitude, releasing their ordnance with devastating accuracy. German forces that had been able to move relatively freely during the overcast days suddenly found themselves under constant air attack. One German tank commander described trying to move his platoon during daylight on December 23rd. We could not move more than 100 metres without aircraft appearing. We spent the entire day hiding in forest, moving only at night. It was like fighting the Soviet Air Force but with better pilots. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest Allied air superiority and was destroyed in the attempt. German fighters Me 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds appeared over Bastogne in groups of 10 to 20 aircraft, attempting to attack the transport aircraft and ground attack aircraft. They were met by American and British fighters flying top cover P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires that had been waiting for exactly this confrontation. The resulting air battles were one-sided, Allied pilots, better trained, and flying superior aircraft shot down German planes at ratios exceeding 10 to 1. By the end of December 23rd, German air activity over Bastogne had ceased. The Luftwaffe still existed, but it no longer operated in daylight over the battlefield. The sky belonged to the Allies. German forces on the ground experienced the air assault as a form of mechanical apocalypse. Artillery positions that had been firing into Bastogne suddenly found themselves targeted by rockets and bombs. Supply convoys moving toward the front were attacked on the roads, vehicles burning and blocking movement. Infantry in assembly areas were strafed by machine gun fire from aircraft, moving too fast to effectively engage with ground fire. The psychological effect exceeded the physical damage. German soldiers, who had spent 8 days besieging Bastogne, confident that their numerical superiority would eventually prevail, now found themselves besieged by air power they could not escape or defeat. German after-action reports from December 23rd spoke of constant air attack and inability to move during daylight, conditions that made offensive operations nearly impossible. Luftwaffe night bombing of Bastogne itself represented Germany's only remaining air option, and it was devastating for those caught in it. On the evening of December 24th, approximately 20 German bombers attacked Bastogne, dropping their ordnance on the town centre where they believed American headquarters and supply dumps were located. The bombs fell primarily on civilian areas and the aid station housed in the Belgian barracks. The barracks took a direct hit, collapsing cellars where wounded men lay. Rescuers spent the night digging through rubble, finding survivors and corpses mixed together. The final count was 30 American wounded killed, along with 12 Belgian civilian volunteers who had been assisting with medical care. The bombing could not affect the siege's outcome. The damage was primarily to wounded who could no longer fight, but It represented the kind of senseless tragedy that war inflicts regardless of military logic. The improvement in weather also allowed reconnaissance aircraft to photograph German positions around Bastogne, providing intelligence that transformed American understanding of their situation. Photo interpreters counted German tanks, identified unit insignia, and tracked movement patterns. This intelligence revealed that German forces surrounding Bastogne had actually decreased since December 20th. Von Manteuffel was pulling units out, redeploying them to other crises, leaving only containment forces around the town. The siege was no longer Germany's main effort. It had become a holding action. This information, relayed to McAuliffe's headquarters, was simultaneously encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it suggested German pressure might decrease. Troubling because it raised the question, if the Germans were reducing forces around Bastogne, where were those forces going and what were they doing? Air resupply continued through December 24th, 25th, and 26th, weather permitting. Total deliveries exceeded 334 tons of supplies, enough to sustain the garrison indefinitely, if necessary. The crisis that had seemed insurmountable on December 22nd, running out of ammunition within days, had been solved by weather and logistics. But the psychological impact mattered more than the tonnage. American defenders, who had watched their ammunition stocks dwindle and wondered if they would have to surrender or die, now knew they could hold indefinitely. Morale, already surprisingly resilient, improved dramatically. German attacks were defeated not just with artillery fire but with the conviction that relief was coming and supplies were unlimited. The mathematics of siege warfare had reversed. Now, the question was not whether Bastogne could hold, but whether the Germans could afford to continue the siege. By December 26th, the strategic situation around Bastogne had transformed completely. The town that had been isolated and desperate 8 days earlier was now resupplied and defiant. Air power provided constant surveillance and attack capability. Ground forces had replenished their ammunition and medical supplies. And, most critically, Patton's Third Army was approaching from the south, its lead elements already engaged with German forces, blocking the relief corridor. The siege was not over. German forces still surrounded the town and continued attacking, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Bastogne would hold because it had already held through the worst. The Germans, facing failure across the entire offensive, were beginning to withdraw forces from the Bastogne sector to prevent greater disasters elsewhere. The climax was approaching, and it would come from the south, where Patton's tanks were grinding through German defences with the single-minded determination that characterised American armour when properly supplied and led. December 19th, 1944, Verdun, France, General George S. Patton Jr. stood before Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower in a drafty chateau, delivering a promise that his staff had told him was impossible. I can attack north with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Eisenhower's other commanders stared at Patton with expressions mixing disbelief and annoyance. Patton's Third Army was currently engaged in offensive operations east of the Merthyr River, attacking toward the Siegfried Line. Disengaging, turning 90 degrees north, moving over 100 miles, and attacking German forces in the Ardennes within 2 days violated every principle of military planning. It required moving over 100,000 men, 15,000 vehicles, and rebuilding an entire supply system on the move. Eisenhower studied Patton's face, looking for the showboating and ego that often characterized the man, and instead saw cold calculation. Eisenhower said simply, "Do it." What followed was one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the Second World War, though it remained overshadowed by the drama of combat. Patton's staff had actually been planning this contingency since December 18th, when the first reports of the German offensive arrived. Colonel Halley Maddox, Third Army's operations officer, had prepared 3 separate plans for disengaging and moving north, each labelled with a code name nickel, dime, and quarter. The plans varied by the number of divisions committed and the speed of movement. When Eisenhower authorised the operation on December 19th, Patton simply radioed his staff, "Execute Plan Nickel." Within 3 hours, divisional commanders were receiving movement orders. Within 6 hours, the first convoys were rolling north. Within 48 hours, elements of the 4th Armoured Division were in contact with German forces south of Bastogne. The movement itself tested the limits of American mobility and logistics. Tank and infantry divisions, engaged in combat operations, had to disengage without the Germans realizing what was happening. Artillery positions had to be abandoned quietly at night. Supply dumps had to be moved or left behind. Headquarters units packed their equipment while staff officers continued planning future operations they knew might never occur. The roads north became parking lots of military vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, artillery pieces, all moving in the same direction at speeds limited by the slowest vehicle. Military police directed traffic at every intersection, preventing the gridlock that could halt the entire movement. Fuel trucks leapfrogged forward, establishing supply points where combat vehicles could refuel without stopping the march. The soldiers riding in those vehicles understood they were being committed to a desperate battle, but morale remained high because they were Patton's men and Patton had promised they would win. Third Army had developed a unique culture under Patton's leadership, one that emphasized aggression, speed, and absolute confidence. Patton's presence was everywhere during the movement north. His jeep racing along the columns, overtaking slower vehicles, Patton himself standing to deliver profane encouragement to soldiers who cheered as he passed. At one supply point, Patton encountered a traffic jam caused by a broken-down tank blocking the road. He personally supervised the tank's removal, cursing the delay, telling the tank crew they were personally responsible for delaying the relief of surrounded American forces. The crew worked with desperate speed, cleared the road in record time. Patton drove on. 4th Armoured Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, received the mission of spearheading the relief. The division was one of the finest armoured formations in the U.S. Army, battle-hardened from months of combat across France. Its battalions were organised into combined arms teams, mixing tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers. Its officers understood mobile warfare and had learned to bypass resistance rather than reduce it, leaving strong points for follow-on forces while the armour continued forward. But even 4th Armoured found the approach to Bastogne nearly impossible. The Germans, recognising that American forces would attempt relief, had organised defences in depth south of Bastogne, using villages, forests, and natural obstacles to channel and slow the American advance. The first major engagement occurred at Warnack on December 23rd, a village held by German Volksgrenadiers with anti-tank gun support. Combat Command A of 4th Armoured attacked at dawn, expecting light resistance. Instead, they encountered a prepared defence that destroyed 5 Shermans in the first 30 minutes. The combat devolved into house-to-house fighting, with American infantry clearing buildings while tanks provided fire support. The battle lasted 7 hours before Warnack fell, by which point Combat Command A had suffered 200 casualties and lost 11 tanks. The division was still 45 miles from Bastogne, and at this rate, relief would take a week. Gaffey radioed Patton, "Resistance heavier than anticipated. Need more time." Patton's response was typically profane and motivational. "I don't care if you lose every tank you have. You get to Bastogne by Christmas or I'll find someone who will." Progress improved as 4th Armoured refined its tactics. Rather than attacking every German position, the division began bypassing strong points when possible, leaving them for the infantry divisions following behind. Task forces operated on parallel routes, reducing the chance that a single roadblock could stop the entire division. Artillery preparation became more intense, with forward observers calling massive concentrations on suspected German positions before tanks advanced. Air support, available after December 23rd, proved decisive. P-47 Thunderbolts circled ahead of advancing American columns, attacking any German resistance before ground forces arrived. The combination of ground and air power accelerated the advance. By December 25th, 4th Armoured had covered 35 miles and was within 15 miles of Bastogne. Christmas Day 1944 was neither holy nor silent for 3rd Army. The advance continued through snow and cold, soldiers eating K rations while their vehicles rolled forward, sleeping in brief increments when the column halted. German resistance intensified as 4th Armoured approached Bastogne. Villages like Bougainville and Assenois became killing grounds where American tanks traded fire with German anti-tank guns at ranges measured in yards. Every advance was purchased with casualties. Tanks burning, infantry cut down by machine gun fire, medics working frantically to stabilise wounded before moving them to rear area aid stations. The casualty count climbed. By Christmas evening, 4th Armoured had lost over 600 men killed and wounded, plus 42 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. But the German forces defending the approach to Bastogne were also suffering. 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, battered by the failed Christmas Eve assault on the Bastogne perimeter, was now defending against Third Army's advance. Continuous air attacks had destroyed much of its artillery support. Supply difficulties meant ammunition was scarce and food scarcer. German soldiers defending these villages were brave and professional, but they were fighting a losing battle against overwhelming force. Every hour they delayed 4th Armoured was an hour purchased with their lives. German commanders knew the defence could not succeed, only delay. Von Manteuffel, tracking the situation from his headquarters, understood that once 4th Armoured reached Bastogne, the entire German position in the southern Ardennes would become untenable. He began planning withdrawal operations while publicly ordering continued resistance. On December 26th, the advance reached its climax at the village of Assenois, 5 miles south of Bastogne. German forces had fortified the village, creating a strongpoint designed to block the final approaches to the surrounded town. Intelligence reported at least 2 companies of infantry, multiple anti-tank guns, and possibly armour. Time had run out for methodical reduction. 4th Armoured needed to reach Bastogne immediately or risk the garrison being overwhelmed by renewed German attacks. The mission was given to Task Force Abrams, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a hard-charging tank officer who would later become Army Chief of Staff. Abrams received orders that were brutally simple. Drive straight up the road to Bastogne. Don't stop for anything. We'll deal with Assenois after you break through. Abrams assembled his force, 10 Sherman tanks, 5 half-tracks carrying infantry, a handful of tank destroyers for overwatch. He briefed his commanders with characteristic bluntness. We're going through Assenois at full speed. You see Germans, you shoot. Don't stop to engage unless absolutely necessary. Our objective is Bastogne, not this village. Questions? There were no questions. Everyone understood this was a cavalry charge with armour, desperate and dangerous, likely to result in high casualties, but also the only way to reach the besieged garrison before dark. At 1600 hours, December 26th, Task Force Abrams lined up on the road south of Assenois, revved their engines, and attacked. December 26th, 1944, 1645 hours, Lieutenant Charles Boggess sat in the commander's hatch of his M4 Sherman at the head of Task Force Abrams's column, watching tracers arc across the road ahead as German machine guns opened fire from Assenois village. His instinct was to stop, deploy infantry, methodically clear the resistance. His orders were to keep moving no matter what happened. Boggess keyed his intercom. Driver, full speed. Gunner, engage targets as they appear. Don't stop for anything. The Sherman accelerated, followed by 9 more tanks and the half-tracks carrying infantry. The charge had begun, and for the next 30 minutes, Boggess would either reach Bastogne or die trying. The German defenders in Assenois had prepared for an American attack, but not for a mechanized charge at full speed through the village centre. Anti-tank guns positioned to engage armour at range found themselves trying to track fast-moving targets at point-blank distances. German infantry in buildings opened fire with Panzerfausts, the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons that were deadly at short range. The lead American tank was hit immediately, brewing up in a fireball that temporarily blocked the road. Boggess's Sherman swerved around the burning wreck, momentarily mounting the curb, then regained the road and continued. Behind him, other tanks were firing on the move, their main guns and machine guns engaging anything that looked like a threat. The half-tracks followed, infantry firing from the moving vehicles, accepting casualties but maintaining momentum. The breakthrough succeeded through speed and audacity more than firepower. German defenders, expecting a methodical American attack preceded by artillery, found themselves fighting individual duels with tanks moving 40 miles per hour through their positions. By the time they engaged one tank, 2 more had passed. Infantry tried to close for Panzerfaust shots, but were cut down by machine gun fire from the half-tracks. The entire passage through Assenois took perhaps 10 minutes, though participants would remember it as longer. Task Force Abrams emerged on the north side of the village, having lost 4 tanks destroyed and 1 half-track knocked out, with 41 casualties. But the task force was through, on the road to Bastogne, with only open ground between them and the perimeter. Inside Bastogne, the sound of tank guns firing to the south had been audible for hours, growing steadily closer. McAuliffe's headquarters tracked Third Army's progress through radio reports and the sound of combat. When forward observers reported American tanks approaching from Assenois, McAuliffe ordered units in the southern perimeter to prepare to link up. The 3rd Battalion, 326 Airborne Engineers, held positions in the path of 4th Armoured's advance. These were not trained infantry but engineers who had been fighting as riflemen since the siege began. They had no tanks, limited heavy weapons, and had been under continuous pressure from German forces to their south. Now, they were about to become the first American unit in Bastogne to make physical contact with relieving forces. The actual link-up was anticlimactic and emotional simultaneously. Bogus's Sherman reached the American perimeter at approximately 1700 hours, encountering engineer positions that had been warned to expect friendly armour but were taking no chances. Bogus, seeing American soldiers in foxholes, stood in his turret and shouted, "Come here! This is the 4th Armoured!" The engineers emerged from their positions, confirming the tank's identity, then began cheering and embracing the tankers. Bogus, asked to be taken to headquarters, was instead connected via field telephone to McAuliffe's command post and delivered the message that officially ended the siege. "This is Lieutenant Bogus. 4th Armoured Division were in." The response from McAuliffe's headquarters came back immediately. "Glad to hear it. Keep coming." But the corridor Task Force Abrams had created was dangerously narrow and under fire from German positions on both sides. The relief corridor, initially just the width of a single road, was barely 200 yards across in places. German machine guns and mortars fired into it continuously. Supply trucks trying to follow the tanks into Bastogne found themselves under direct fire, drivers killed at their wheels, vehicles burning. Engineers worked frantically to widen the corridor, attacking German positions on the flanks while more 4th Armoured units pushed through. The first night, December 26th into December 27th, was chaotic. American forces trying to expand the corridor, German forces trying to close it, firefights erupting along the entire length. The first supply convoy to reach Bastogne through the corridor arrived on the evening of December 26th, 30 trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. The convoy took casualties driving through German fire, losing 4 trucks and 11 men, but the remaining vehicles reached Bastogne's supply points and began unloading. Artillery batteries that had been rationing ammunition suddenly had full stocks. Tank destroyers received the 3-inch rounds they had been hoarding. Medical teams received enough supplies to treat the wounded properly rather than rationing bandages and morphine. The psychological impact exceeded even the physical. The defenders were no longer isolated, no longer dependent on airdrops, no longer fighting with finite resources against an enemy with unlimited supply. German forces made determined efforts to cut the corridor and re-isolate Bastogne. On December 27th, Panzer Lehr Division attacked from the east, attempting to reach the road and sever the connection. The attack was defeated by a combination of American infantry, artillery, and air support, but it came close to succeeding. German tanks reached within 500 yards of the corridor before being stopped by concentrated fire from tank destroyers and artillery. The battle demonstrated that the relief corridor was not secure and would require constant defence. 4th Armoured Division, rather than pushing through Bastogne and continuing north, found itself committed to widening and defending the corridor, fighting battles that looked more like sieges than mobile operations. The expansion of the corridor over the next 4 days represented continuous combat with no clear front lines. American units attacked outward from Bastogne, trying to push German forces back and create buffer zones. 4th Armoured attacked northward from Assenois, trying to widen the corridor and link up with units attacking from inside the perimeter. The fighting was often at close quarters, tank duels at ranges under 100 yards, infantry combat in villages and forests, artillery duels between batteries that could see each other. Casualties mounted on both sides. By December 31st, the corridor had widened to approximately 2 miles, defensible but still threatened by German forces holding positions on both flanks. The relief of Bastogne did not end the siege immediately because German forces did not withdraw, but rather shifted to containing the widened perimeter. The psychological siege was over, defenders knew they were connected to friendly forces and could be evacuated if necessary, but combat continued. German artillery still shelled Bastogne daily. German infantry continued probing attacks around the expanded perimeter. The town remained dangerous, damaged, filled with exhausted soldiers and wounded civilians. But the critical question had been answered. Bastogne had held. The 101st Airborne Division, supported by various attached units, had defended the town for 8 days while surrounded, defeating multiple German assaults, surviving supply shortages, and maintaining morale under conditions that should have resulted in surrender. McAuliffe's headquarters compiled statistics in the days following relief, trying to quantify what the siege had cost and accomplished. American casualties inside the perimeter, approximately 1,600 killed, 3,800 wounded, 400 missing. German casualties around Bastogne, estimated 15 to 20,000 killed, wounded or captured. Equipment losses. Americans lost 43 tanks and tank destroyers. Germans lost over 48 tanks and 141 artillery pieces. But the strategic impact exceeded these numbers. The defence of Bastogne had delayed the German offensive by at least a week, consumed forces the Germans could not afford to lose, and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could no longer achieve operational surprise or breakthrough, even with massive force concentration. Hitler's last offensive had failed, partly because a small town in Belgium had refused to surrender. By early January 1945, Bastogne's situation had stabilised. The corridor was widened and secured. Reinforcements arrived daily, bringing fresh divisions to replace the exhausted defenders. The 101st Airborne, which should have been evacuated for rest and refit, was instead ordered to continue fighting, attacking north from Bastogne to reduce the German salient. The division would not leave Belgium until February, having fought continuously for over 2 months, but the siege itself was over. The civilians returned to find their town destroyed, over 700 buildings damaged or demolished. The soldiers who had defended the town received decorations. The entire 101st was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, the first time an entire division received the honour. Individual soldiers received Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, and Distinguished Service Crosses. McAuliffe received promotion and celebrity. But the real victory was simpler. They had held when holding seemed impossible. They had fought when defeat appeared certain. And they had won. December 27th, 1944, 0800 hours. Major Richard Winters looked across the snow-covered fields north of Bastogne toward the village of Foy, which had been in German hands since December 19th and now needed to be recaptured. His battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry had been ordered to attack part of the wider American effort to expand the relief corridor and push German forces back from Bastogne. Winters studied the terrain through binoculars, open ground offering no cover, German positions in the village with good fields of fire, likely minefields and wire obstacles. This would not be the defensive fighting that had characterised the siege, but rather offensive operations against prepared positions. Winters turned to his company commanders and delivered the attack order, knowing that by nightfall some of these men would be dead. The shift from defensive to offensive operations began immediately after the corridor was established. Eisenhower's orders to Third Army were explicit: relieve Bastogne, then continue, attacking north to reduce the German salient. This meant that units which had spent over a week defending fixed positions while surrounded now had to reorganise for mobile offensive operations. The 101st Airborne, exhausted and depleted, should have been pulled out of the line for rest. Instead, they received orders to attack. McAuliffe protested to 8th Corps headquarters, arguing his division needed time to recover. The response was sympathetic but firm. No reserve divisions were available, the counter-offensive needed to begin immediately, the 101st would continue fighting. McAuliffe relayed the orders to his regimental commanders with resignation. "Gentlemen, we attack tomorrow. I know you're tired. The Germans are tired too. First one to give up loses." The attack on Foy exemplified the challenges of transitioning from defensive to offensive warfare. The 506th Parachute Infantry, which had defended a sector of the perimeter with reasonable success, now had to cross open ground under fire to assault a fortified village. The attack plan was conventional, artillery preparation followed by infantry assault with supporting armour. But the infantry was depleted from the siege. Companies that should have numbered 150 men, fielding perhaps 90. The artillery, though resupplied, was firing batteries that had gone days without maintenance. The supporting armour consisted of 3 Shermans, the only tanks available for this sector. The attack launched at 0900 hours and immediately encountered problems. German forces defending Foy were veterans of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division who had learned to respect American artillery and had prepared accordingly. Their positions were dug deep, with overhead cover against shell fragments. Machine guns were positioned for interlocking fire, covering all likely approaches. Anti-tank guns covered the road, where American armour would have to advance. When American artillery began falling on Foy, the Germans simply sheltered in their positions and waited. When the artillery lifted and American infantry began crossing the open ground, German machine guns opened fire with devastating effect. The first wave of attackers, approximately 80 men, was reduced to half strength before reaching the village outskirts. The attack stalled, pinned down by fire, unable to advance or retreat effectively. Winters, watching from the command post, faced the eternal commander's dilemma: reinforce and risk more casualties, or withdraw and accept failure. He chose a third option: flanking attack. Rather than continuing the frontal assault, he redirected his remaining reserve platoon to approach Foy from the west, where German defences appeared weaker. The flanking force, led by Lieutenant Ronald Spears, moved through dead ground to avoid German observation, then assaulted into Foy's western edge. The surprise was sufficient to gain a foothold. German defenders, fighting on two fronts simultaneously, began falling back toward the village centre. American forces pushed inward from multiple directions, clearing buildings in close-quarters combat that was brutal and exhausting. By 1400 hours, Foy was secured, though at a cost of 23 Americans killed and 52 wounded. German casualties were estimated at over 70 killed and 40 captured. Similar battles occurred across the expanding perimeter as American forces attacked villages that had been German strongpoints during the siege. Marvey, Bizery, Warden, each required its own assault. Each cost casualties, each demonstrated that offensive operations were harder than defensive fighting. The soldiers conducting these attacks were already exhausted from the siege, low on sleep, suffering from frostbite and combat fatigue. But they continued attacking because that was what professional soldiers did when ordered. One private, interviewed years later, described the period from December 27th through December 31st as worse than the siege itself, because at least during the siege we could stay in our foxholes. Now we had to stand up and walk toward the Germans while they shot at us. The German withdrawal from Bastogne was not a rout, but rather a fighting retreat conducted with professional competence. German commanders, recognizing that the siege had failed and that remaining would only result in encirclement themselves, began pulling forces back to new defensive lines 6 to 8 miles from Bastogne. They left behind rearguard units to delay American pursuit, sacrificing these formations to save the main body. The German equipment losses were staggering. Over 450 vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel or because they were damaged. 48 tanks left behind. 141 artillery pieces destroyed or captured because there was no way to withdraw them. But the German forces themselves, the soldiers who had fought around Bastogne, mostly escaped to fight again. This was simultaneously an American success and a missed opportunity. Bastogne was relieved and the siege broken, but the German forces were not destroyed. Prisoner interrogations provided insight into German morale and conditions during the siege. German soldiers captured during the widening described supply shortages worse than American defenders had faced. Many had not eaten hot food in over a week. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Wounded, who could not walk, were left behind. Ammunition was so short that some units had been ordered to conserve rifle ammunition and rely on machine guns, but German discipline had remained intact throughout. Prisoners expressed surprise that Bastogne had held so long, but they also expressed professional respect for the defenders. One captured lieutenant, asked what he thought of American forces, replied, "Your artillery is terrifying. Your soldiers fight well. But what I don't understand is why you didn't surrender. We had you surrounded. We outnumbered you. Your position was hopeless. Why did you keep fighting?" The American interrogator's response was not recorded, but the question itself revealed the cultural gap. Germans could not comprehend fighting without hope of victory. Civilian casualties during the siege and its aftermath were significant but difficult to quantify precisely. Belgian Red Cross surveys, conducted in January 1945, documented 782 buildings in Bastogne destroyed or damaged beyond repair out of approximately 900 total structures. The town centre was over 70% destroyed. Civilian casualties were estimated at between 120 and 180 killed, with perhaps 300 wounded. Many civilians had sheltered in cellars throughout the siege, emerging after relief to find their homes destroyed. The American military government established refugee centres and provided food and medical care, but rebuilding Bastogne would take years. The town's economic base, agriculture, and small industry was shattered. Unexploded ordnance, contaminated fields and forests. The war had consumed Bastogne as thoroughly as it consumed military units. The expansion of the perimeter also revealed evidence of war crimes committed during the siege. American patrols discovered bodies of American prisoners shot while bound, evidence of execution rather than combat deaths. Belgian civilians reported German soldiers killing civilians suspected of aiding Americans. These atrocities were not systematic or ordered from high command, but rather individual acts by soldiers fighting in desperate circumstances. Both sides filed formal protests through neutral countries, and both sides largely ignored the protests because the war's outcome mattered more than legal niceties. Soldiers who witnessed these crimes remembered them, and some took revenge when opportunities arose. The moral degradation that extended combat produces affected both armies by early January 1945. By December 31st, the widening operation had achieved its objectives. The corridor was approximately 2 miles wide, defensible, and secured by multiple American divisions. German forces had withdrawn to positions 8 to 10 miles from Bastogne, where they established new defensive lines. The immediate threat to the town was over. Statistics compiled by 8th Corps headquarters revealed the campaign's scope. American casualties in the Bastogne area from December 16th through December 31st totaled approximately 7,500 killed and wounded. German casualties exceeded 25,000. The exchange ratio favoured the Americans by more than 3 to 1, reflecting the advantages of defensive fighting and artillery concentration. But the human cost, measured in grieving families and crippled survivors, could not be reduced to ratios. The 101st Airborne Division promised rest after relief, instead received orders to continue offensive operations through January and into February. The division would fight continuously for over 2 months, the longest sustained combat deployment of any American airborne unit in the war. Casualties accumulated. Companies that had entered Belgium in December with 150 men were reduced to 80 or 90 by February. Fresh replacements arrived. Teenage soldiers who had to learn combat skills from exhausted veterans. The division's identity began to change, from the closely bonded unit that jumped into Normandy to a more transient organisation where veterans and replacements mixed uneasily. But the division's reputation was secure. They were the men who held Bastogne, and that identity would define them for the rest of their lives. January 10th, 1945, German Field Marshal Hasso von Manteufel's headquarters, Eastern Germany. Von Manteuffel sat before a typewriter, composing his after-action report on the Ardennes offensive, trying to explain how Germany's last great attack had failed. The statistics were damning. 100,000 German casualties, 600 tanks destroyed, the entire offensive reserves consumed in 3 weeks of fighting. But von Manteuffel's analysis focused on a single geographic point, Bastogne. He typed slowly, choosing words carefully. The American defense of Bastogne prevented exploitation of our initial breakthrough. Had the town fallen on December 19th or 20th as planned, our supply routes would have been secured, and our armoured spearheads could have reached the Meuse with adequate fuel. The failure to take Bastogne was the operational turning point of the campaign. Von Manteuffel reviewed the paragraph, knew it would anger his superiors because it implied German failure rather than American success, and included it anyway because it was true. The strategic analysis of Bastogne's importance began. Even before the siege ended, staff officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force compiled studies showing how the defence had disrupted German operations across the entire Ardennes front. The most obvious impact was logistical. German supply convoys, unable to use the roads through Bastogne, were forced onto forest tracks that consumed fuel, time, and vehicles. Panzer divisions that should have been refuelled and ready for exploitation instead sat immobilised, waiting for supplies that arrived too slowly or not at all. The 2nd Panzer Division reached the Meuse River on December 24th but ran out of fuel before it could cross. That division was subsequently surrounded and destroyed, losing over 80% of its equipment. Had Bastogne fallen, 2nd Panzer would have had fuel to cross the Meuse and possibly reach Dinant, achieving the operational breakthrough Hitler sought. But logistics was only part of Bastogne's strategic value. The defence forced Germany to commit forces to a siege that was never part of the operational plan. Parts of 7 German divisions were tied down around Bastogne when those divisions were needed elsewhere. 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, elite troops that should have been exploiting the breakthrough, instead spent a week attacking American positions and suffering catastrophic casualties. 26th Volksgrenadier Division, tasked with protecting the southern flank, was instead committed to the Bastogne siege and rendered combat ineffective by continuous losses. These forces consumed in attacking a position they never captured, represented roughly 15,000 men who were unavailable for other missions. In an offensive where Germany was already outnumbered, this diversion of force was operationally fatal. The temporal dimension was equally critical. The German operational plan required reaching the Meuse River by December 20th, crossing on December 21st, and advancing on Antwerp by December 25th. These timelines were optimistic but achievable if everything went perfectly. Bastogne's defence introduced delays that cascaded through the entire operation. German forces that should have been advancing west were instead besieging the town. Supply convoys that should have been moving freely were instead navigating detours. Command attention that should have been focused on exploitation was instead devoted to the siege. By December 25th, when Hitler's plan called for German forces to reach Antwerp, the deepest German penetration was still 40 miles from the Meuse. The delays caused by Bastogne, measured in hours and days, had accumulated to operational failure measured in weeks. Eisenhower's assessment, delivered to his staff on January 3rd, was characteristically direct. Bastogne saved the campaign. Not because the terrain was particularly valuable, but because McAuliffe and his men refused to surrender it. Their defence gave us time to organise, counterattacks, concentrate forces, and turn a potential disaster into a German catastrophe. Eisenhower ordered the entire 101st Airborne Division awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, an unprecedented honour for an entire division. The citation language emphasised not just courage, but effectiveness. The 101st Airborne Division stood alone, holding Bastogne against overwhelming odds, denying the enemy the roads essential to his advance, disrupting his timetable, and exemplifying the courage and determination of American arms. German commanders, facing the consequences of failure, debated whether Bastogne should have been handled differently. Von Lüttwitz, who commanded the forces immediately around Bastogne, argued that the town should have been bypassed entirely, ignored as irrelevant to the main drive toward Antwerp. Model, his superior, countered that bypassing Bastogne would have left American forces in position to attack German supply lines and rear areas. The debate revealed a fundamental German problem. Their plan required both bypassing obstacles to maintain speed and reducing those obstacles to secure supply routes. These were contradictory requirements, and Bastogne exemplified the contradiction. The Germans tried both approaches simultaneously, achieving neither effectively. The result was operational paralysis disguised as activity. The material costs of the Ardennes offensive, with Bastogne as its centrepiece, were catastrophic for Germany. 600 tanks destroyed or abandoned represented nearly 2 months of German production. 500,000 gallons of fuel consumed represented nearly 1 week of total German fuel production. 100,000 casualties, including 15,000 killed, represented losses that could not be replaced from Germany's shrinking manpower pool. The equipment and men consumed in the Ardennes were not available for the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces launched a massive January offensive that would carry them into Germany itself. Some historians argue that the Ardennes offensive, by consuming Germany's last reserves, actually accelerated Germany's defeat by making effective defence impossible elsewhere. Bastogne's defence contributed to this outcome by ensuring the offensive's failure. The human cost assessment was more complex and painful. American casualties in the Bastogne area approached 7,500 killed and wounded. Allied casualties across the entire Bulge exceeded 75,000. German casualties exceeded 100,000. Belgian civilian casualties approached 3,000, mostly in the Bastogne area. These numbers, compiled by statisticians in rear area offices, represented families destroyed, communities shattered, and lives ended. The siege itself, 8 days of combat in December 1944, killed approximately 1,600 Americans defending Bastogne and perhaps 5,000 Germans attacking it. Whether those deaths were justified by strategic necessity or simply the price paid for others' decisions remains debated by historians and veterans. Medical consequences extended far beyond immediate casualties. Frostbite cases from the siege numbered in the thousands, with many requiring amputations that occurred months after the battle when infection set in. Combat fatigue, later called post-traumatic stress disorder, affected veterans of Bastogne at rates exceeding other engagements. The combination of cold, isolation, continuous combat, and witnessing terrible violence produced psychological damage that some veterans never recovered from. The Veterans Administration would deal with Bastogne survivors' medical and psychological needs for decades after the war ended. The true cost of the siege, measured in broken bodies and traumatized minds, exceeded anything measurable during the battle itself. The Belgian town of Bastogne itself became a memorial to the siege, its identity permanently shaped by 8 days of combat. The Martyrs Memorial, constructed in 1950, commemorated American forces who fought in the Ardennes. The memorial's design, a 5-pointed star visible from the air, paid homage to the American divisions that participated. Belgian families adopted American graves, tending them with flowers and respect. Each December, the town hosted memorial ceremonies where aging veterans returned, accompanied by fewer comrades each year to remember what happened. The siege became Bastogne's primary identity, a town that had been destroyed but had also witnessed American courage and determination. Tourism based on battlefield sites became an important part of the local economy, a strange outcome for a siege that nearly destroyed the town. By January 1945, when the strategic assessments were being written, the outcome was clear. Bastogne's defence had been strategically decisive. The town's 7 roads, so ordinary in peacetime, had become the strategic centre of Germany's last offensive. Holding those roads denied Germany the mobility needed for exploitation. The defence consumed German forces and time that could not be replaced. And psychologically, Bastogne demonstrated that American forces could stand and fight under the worst conditions, surrounded and outnumbered, and still prevail. German commanders, planning defensive operations for the battles they knew were coming, understood that if Americans could hold Bastogne, they could hold anything. The siege had not just failed to achieve German objectives, it had demonstrated that German objectives were no longer achievable. The war would continue for 4 more months, but after Bastogne, the outcome was certain. December 16th, 1994, Bastogne, Belgium. 80-year-old Donald Malarkey stood in the Bois Jacques forest, snow falling on the preserved foxholes where he had fought 50 years earlier. Around him, other veterans of the 101st, Airborne, gathered for the 50th anniversary commemoration, fewer than half the men who had survived the siege still alive to attend. Malarkey looked at the foxhole that had been his position, remarkably unchanged by 5 decades, and tried to explain to a young reporter why he had returned. I needed to see if I could still feel them here. The men who didn't make it, I needed to know they weren't forgotten. The reporter asked if he felt proud of what he had accomplished. Malarkey's response captured something essential about combat veterans. I'm not proud. Proud is the wrong word. I'm grateful I survived. I'm grateful I didn't let my friends down. But proud? No. You don't get proud about things that are terrible. The long-term casualties of the Bastogne siege extended far beyond the official count of 1,600 killed and 3,800 wounded. Frostbite victims numbered in the thousands, many of whom required amputations years after the battle when circulation problems or infection made it necessary. These amputations, occurring in veterans' hospitals in the 1950s and 60s, were directly attributable to the December 1944 siege, but not counted in official casualty figures. Walter Gordon, who lost toes to frostbite during the siege, ultimately had his leg amputated below the knee in 1962. He told his doctor, "I really lost this leg in Bastogne. It just took 18 years to finish the job." Post-traumatic stress, though not diagnosed or named during the war, affected Bastogne veterans at rates that surprised medical professionals. Many soldiers who appeared fine immediately after the siege developed symptoms years or decades later. Nightmares, anxiety, difficulty with sudden noises, inability to handle cold weather. Some veterans could not attend Christmas celebrations because December 24th triggered traumatic memories of the Christmas Eve assault. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when friends died. The psychological legacy of Bastogne would burden veterans for their entire lives, though most never sought treatment because their generation did not acknowledge mental health issues openly. The 101st Airborne Division continued fighting after Bastogne, remaining in Belgium until February 1945. The division then returned to France for rest and refit before being deployed for occupation duty in Bavaria after Germany's surrender. Many veterans who survived Bastogne would be killed in subsequent operations. The division's casualty rate during the European campaign exceeded 100%, meaning the average soldier position turned over completely during the war. By VE Day, The division that had held Bastogne consisted primarily of replacements who had not participated in the siege but inherited its legacy and reputation. German survivors of the Bastogne fighting fared worse than their American counterparts. Most German units that fought around Bastogne were subsequently committed to defensive battles on the eastern and western fronts, where casualties approached total. 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, which had attacked Bastogne on Christmas Eve, was virtually destroyed in subsequent fighting, with few members surviving the war. German prisoners captured at Bastogne spent years in Allied prison camps, returning to a Germany divided and occupied. Some prisoners were tried for war crimes related to atrocities during the siege. Most simply returned to destroyed homes and shattered families, trying to rebuild lives in the ruins of the Third Reich. Belgian civilians who survived the siege faced their own challenges. Bastogne's population of 4,000 was reduced to perhaps 1,000 by January 1945, the others having fled as refugees or been killed. Those who returned found over 70% of the town destroyed. Reconstruction took years and was never complete. Some historic buildings were lost permanently. The town's economy, based on agriculture and small-scale industry, was disrupted for a generation. But Belgians also took pride in their town's role in Allied victory. Streets were renamed to honour American units. A museum dedicated to the siege was established. Belgian families adopted American graves in the local cemetery, tending them with flowers every week, a practice that continues today. The legacy of nuts extended far beyond military history into popular culture. McAuliffe's one-word refusal became synonymous with American determination and defiance. The story was taught in schools, appeared in movies and books, and became part of American mythology about World War II. Some aspects of the story were embellished. McAuliffe was sometimes portrayed as standing atop a tank when he delivered the message, or as using more colourful language. But the core truth remained. When offered surrender terms by an enemy that outnumbered and surrounded his forces, McAuliffe had responded with dismissive contempt. That attitude, more than any tactical decision, defined how Americans remembered Bastogne. The strategic legacy of Bastogne influenced military doctrine for decades. The siege demonstrated the importance of holding key terrain even when surrounded. It showed that air resupply could sustain isolated forces if weather permitted. It proved that concentrated artillery could defeat larger forces if properly employed. These lessons were studied at military academies, incorporated into doctrine, and influenced American military planning through the Cold War and beyond. The concept of the Bastogne defense, holding a position surrounded on all sides while awaiting relief, became a recognized tactical concept. Modern Bastogne is a living memorial to the siege. The town's population has grown to approximately 15,000, but its identity remains shaped by December 1944. The Martyson Memorial, visible from approaching roads, dominates the landscape. The Bastogne War Museum, opened in 2014, uses multimedia exhibits to tell the siege's story. Each December, reenactors wearing vintage uniforms conduct commemorative ceremonies. The foxholes in Bois-Jacques Forest are preserved, marked with explanatory signs. Tourists from around the world visit annually, walking the ground where the battle occurred, trying to understand what happened. Veterans who return to Bastogne decades later often struggle to reconcile their memories with the rebuilt town. The Bastogne they remembered was destroyed, burning, filled with dead and wounded. The modern town, prosperous and peaceful, seemed disconnected from their experiences. Some veterans found the commemorations therapeutic, an acknowledgement that their sacrifices had meaning. Others found them uncomfortable, feeling that no commemoration could capture the reality of what they had endured. Major Richard Winters, interviewed for the 2001 book and miniseries Band of Brothers, said of returning to Bastogne, "It's important that people remember, but I'm not sure we can really explain what it was like to people who weren't there. The cold, the fear, the exhaustion, watching friends die. Those are experiences you can describe, but not truly convey." The question of why Bastogne endures in memory, why this particular siege captured public imagination more than other equally desperate battles, has multiple answers. Partly it was timing. The siege occurred when Allied victory seemed certain, making the German offensive shocking and the American defence more dramatic. Partly it was simplicity. A surrounded force holding against superior numbers is an easily understood narrative. Partly it was personality. McAuliffe's nuts, provided a quotable, memorable symbol of defiance. And partly it was outcome. Bastogne held, the relief arrived, the defenders survived. The siege had a happy ending, unlike many World War II battles that ended in defeat or Pyrrhic victory. But perhaps the deepest reason Bastogne endures is what it revealed about human endurance under impossible circumstances. The soldiers defending Bastogne were not supermen. They were ordinary Americans, many drafted from civilian life, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were cold, hungry, low on ammunition, and surrounded by enemies who outnumbered them. By every rational calculation, they should have surrendered or been overwhelmed. Instead, they held their positions, fought their battles, and trusted that someone would come for them. When asked how they did it, most veterans gave similar answers. They fought for the men beside them, they didn't want to let their friends down, they believed their leaders when told relief was coming. These were human motivations, not superhuman ones. And that made the defense both more impressive and more accessible to those trying to understand it. The final assessment of the Bastogne siege, compiled by military historians over decades, credits the defense with altering the course of World War II in Europe. By holding the town, American forces denied Germany the roads needed for operational success. By consuming German forces in time, the defenders ensured the Ardennes offensive would fail. By demonstrating American determination and capability, they contributed to German demoralization and Allied confidence. These were strategic effects from a tactical defense, the kind of outcome that defines decisive battles. 80 years later, when military professionals study sieges and surrounded forces, Bastogne remains the exemplary case. A surrounded force that held not just physically, but psychologically, maintaining cohesion and fighting effectiveness under conditions that should have caused collapse. On December 16, 2024, the 80th anniversary of the battle's beginning, fewer than 5 veterans of the siege remained alive. The last living connections to that December week were ending. But Bastogne itself endures, both as place and memory. The town continues its commemorations. The museums remain open. Students study the battle in classrooms. And occasionally, someone visits the preserved foxholes in Barrages, stands in the snow, and tries to imagine what it was like to be 19 years old, frozen, surrounded, and ordered to hold at all costs. The answer, for those who were actually there, was simple. You held because you had to, because your friends depended on you, because surrender was unthinkable. That answer, given by aging veterans to younger generations, remains Bastogne's essential lesson. When everything seems impossible, when defeat appears certain, you hold. And sometimes, if you hold long enough, relief arrives. The defenders of Bastogne proved this, paid for it with their suffering and sacrifice, and created a legacy that echoes through military history. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and expected to fail. They didn't. That is why, 80 years later, we remember Bastogne.